Cleopatra is often painted as the ultimate symbol of ancient Egypt, draped in gold, walking among pyramids, ruling alongside pharaohs in a land of gods and tombs. Cleopatra would totally approve if you hit that like button and subscribe. Don't disappoint a queen. But history has a surprise twist. Cleopatra actually lived closer in time to the invention of the iPhone than to the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The pyramid was completed around 2560 BCE. Cleopatra died in 30 BCE. That's more than 2,500 years between her and the pyramid, and just over 2,000 years between her and us. This staggering timeline flips our assumptions about ancient history. Cleopatra lived in a world that was already looking back on the pyramids as relics. To her, they were ancient wonders, as awe-inspiring and mysterious as they are to us now. Even more fascinating, Cleopatra wasn't even ethnically Egyptian. She was Macedonian Greek, descended from Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Her dynasty had ruled Egypt for centuries, blending Greek and Egyptian culture. Cleopatra was the first of her family to learn Egyptian, a move that helped solidify her power among the people. She was a political genius, fluent in multiple languages, navigating a collapsing empire while negotiating with Rome. Her world wasn't full of pyramid builders. It was full of shifting alliances, Roman expansion, and high-stakes diplomacy. When we imagine Cleopatra standing next to newly built pyramids, we're looking at a historical mirage. In truth, she was living in their long shadow, not their construction site. In 1680, a blazing comet streaked across the European sky, a fiery, mysterious visitor that sent people into panic. Back then, astronomy was still entangled with superstition, and celestial events were seen as omens of divine judgment. This particular comet was so dramatic, so unforgettable, that even the church couldn't ignore it. And so, in one of the strangest moments in papal history, the comet was declared a tool of the devil and, according to legend, excommunicated. Pope Innocent XI, facing widespread hysteria, took action not against people, but against a space rock. Of course, the Vatican didn't send a formal document hurtling into the sky, but the event became symbolic of the tension between religion and early science. The church was struggling to maintain authority over a world it couldn't fully explain. Celestial bodies had long been woven into religious narratives. Stars guided wise men. Eclipses signaled doom. But comets? They were unruly, unpredictable. Scientists like Isaac Newton were starting to decode their behavior, but fear still held power. And so the idea of excommunicating a comet wasn't about theology. It was about control. It was a theatrical gesture aimed at calming the terrified faithful. In modern terms, it's like banning a thunderstorm. Absurd, yes, but also a window into how institutions respond when their worldviews are threatened by forces they can't yet understand. In the age before reason fully took hold, even the heavens could find themselves on trial. When we think of gladiators, we imagine brutal fights to the death in blood-soaked arenas, crowds roaring for a final blow. Hollywood thrives on that image, but real Roman gladiatorial combat was far more complex and often less deadly than we've been led to believe. Gladiators were expensive. They were trained professionals, housed, fed, and sometimes sponsored by wealthy patrons. Their value didn't lie in dying quickly, but in putting on a show. Many matches were choreographed to a degree, with rules, referees, and even mercy. If a gladiator performed well, even in defeat, the crowd or sponsor could spare his life. In fact, historical records suggest that the majority of gladiatorial battles ended without death. Some estimates say only around 10% were fatal. Injuries? Yes. Blood? Absolutely. But death was bad business. Gladiators were investments, not disposable entertainment. Some became celebrities, with fans, merchandise, and graffiti scrawled in their honor. Others earned their freedom after years of combat. The bloodlust of the crowd was real, but so was the appreciation for skill, endurance, and spectacle. And while some emperors, like the notoriously cruel Commodus, broke these conventions, they were the exception. The idea of constant death matches is a distortion. The truth is more nuanced. Gladiator games were a mix of sport, theater, and propaganda, designed to thrill, not just to kill. The arena wasn't always a slaughterhouse. It was a stage, and the fighters were performers just as much as they were warriors. In the 1904 Olympics held in St. Louis, Missouri, the marathon was a chaotic, surreal disaster from start to finish, and one runner took that chaos to a whole new level. His name was Fred Lors, an American who started the race like everyone else, on foot, in brutal heat, on dusty roads. But after running about 9 miles, Lors gave up, overheated and cramping. That should have been the end of it. But instead of quitting, he hitched a ride. A friend in a car picked him up, and Lors waved cheerfully at spectators as he drove by. After nearly 11 miles in the vehicle, he got out, rejoined the race, and jogged across the finish line to thunderous applause. Officials crowned him the winner. Cameras flashed. The crowd cheered. President Roosevelt's daughter even posed for photos with him. But then the truth came out. Other runners reported seeing him ride. Lors confessed, sheepishly claiming it was a joke. The medal was revoked, and he was temporarily banned from competition. That marathon didn't just have one bizarre moment. Another runner was nearly poisoned by his own trainers, who gave him a mix of brandy and strychnine. Another was chased off course by wild dogs. Only 14 of the 32 starters finished. The 1904 marathon wasn't a triumph of sport. It was a comic, dangerous mess. And Fred Lors' ride is still one of the most bizarre cheating scandals in Olympic history, one that started as a joke and ended in worldwide headlines. When most people imagine a coffin, they picture the classic six-sided shape, narrow at the head and foot, wider at the shoulders. But that design is not some universal norm. It's a cultural invention shaped by aesthetics, religious symbolism, and practical considerations. The six-sided coffin, often called a toe pincher, became popular in 18th and 19th century Europe and North America. The tapered design was partly a way to save wood and reduce the weight of the coffin, but it also became a visual shorthand for death in art and media. Before that, coffins weren't always used at all. In ancient Egypt, bodies were buried in sarcophagi, stone boxes that were often rectangular. In China, rectangular wooden coffins were the norm. In Jewish and Islamic traditions, burial often takes place in simple, undecorated boxes or even shrouds, with no focus on the shape at all. In some cultures, like in Ghana, elaborate fantasy coffins are carved in the shape of objects reflecting the deceased's life. Cars, animals, even airplanes. In modern Western funerals, the six-sided coffin has largely given way to rectangular caskets, which are easier to manufacture and transport. Yet the classic tapered shape remains deeply embedded in popular culture, especially in horror films and Halloween imagery. Its pointed angles seem to suggest finality, a narrowing of the human form into death. But in truth, it's just one of many burial customs shaped not by necessity, but by belief, tradition, and the human urge to give shape, even elegant shape, to the end. The corkscrew, such a simple tool, but so cleverly designed, has its roots not in wine, but in weaponry. The earliest known corkscrew was invented in England during the 17th century, and it was likely inspired by a similar tool used to extract bullets and wadding from musket barrels. Wine bottles during this era had long, thin necks and were sealed with tightly packed corks, which made opening them a real challenge. As wine consumption grew across Europe, especially among the upper classes, the need for a reliable way to uncork bottles became more apparent. The first patent for a corkscrew was issued in 1795 to a man named Samuel Henshaw. His design added a simple yet crucial feature, a button or disc that helped press against the cork and ease its removal. This small addition made the corkscrew far more efficient and easier to use. From there, the design evolved, but the basic helix and handle concept remained the same. It's fascinating to think that a tool we now associate with celebrations and fine dining actually originated from the battlefield. Over time, corkscrews became ornate collector's items, some made of silver or ivory, especially in Victorian England. Others were multifunctional, combining blades, bottle openers, and more. But the core idea, a twisted metal spiral capable of gripping and pulling, has endured. Today, corkscrews are a kitchen staple, and while we rarely think about their origins, each twist into a bottle carries a little bit of 17th century English ingenuity. Leonid Brezhnev, the longtime Soviet leader who governed the USSR from 1964 to 1982, had many characteristics typical of Cold War-era strongmen: a stern image, a rigid political style, and a fondness for military parades. But one detail stands out: his obsession with medals. By the time of his death, Brezhnev had been awarded over 100 medals and decorations, including 4 Hero of the Soviet Union awards and multiple orders of Lenin. It became almost comical. Official photos of him showed so many medals on his chest that it looked more like armor than uniform. Some of these were genuine recognitions of his service in World War II and leadership roles, but many were symbolic, self-issued, or politically motivated. In fact, Brezhnev personally approved some of the awards he received. This medal mania wasn't just vanity. It was part of a broader Soviet culture of glorifying leadership and displaying state-sanctioned heroism. Brezhnev's image was carefully cultivated, and the medals played into the persona of a decorated war veteran and father of the nation. But even within the USSR, this excess drew quiet ridicule. Jokes circulated about how he might one day fall over from the weight of his own awards. After his death, reform-minded Soviets like Gorbachev distanced themselves from the over-the-top symbolism that marked Brezhnev's era. Yet the image of Brezhnev with a chest full of medals remains a defining visual of late Soviet leadership, where appearance often mattered more than substance, and prestige was measured in glittering rows of metal. The Christian cross, as most people recognize it today, with its long vertical beam intersected by a shorter horizontal one, was not always the standard symbol of the faith. In fact, early Christians were hesitant to depict the cross at all. It was, after all, a method of brutal Roman execution. The first Christians instead used more subtle or abstract symbols, like the fish or ichthys, which doubled as a secret sign among persecuted believers. It wasn't until centuries later, after Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion, that the cross began appearing as a dominant symbol. And even then, its shape varied. Some early crosses looked more like the letter T, or had equal-length arms, like the Greek cross. Others were more decorative, incorporating circles, floral elements, or even images of Christ as triumphant rather than suffering. The version most recognized today, the Latin cross, became standard over time, shaped by church art, theology, and iconography in Western Europe. Eastern Orthodox Christians often use a cross with 3 horizontal bars, and Coptic Christians have their own variations. What's striking is how a device of torture was transformed into a symbol of hope, redemption, and victory over death. It wasn't a smooth transition. It required time, cultural shifts, and theological reinterpretation. By adopting the cross, Christianity essentially rebranded an instrument of pain into a universal emblem of grace. So when you see a cross now, remember, its form wasn't inevitable. It evolved, shaped by centuries of changing belief, art, and historical context. Tutankhamun's golden funerary mask is one of the most iconic artifacts ever discovered, a gleaming image of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship and symbolism. What many people don't realize is that this mask is not just a thin decorative piece. It weighs over 10 kilograms, or about 22 pounds. That weight alone makes it astonishing. Crafted primarily of solid gold and inlaid with semi-precious stones like lapis lazuli, turquoise, and obsidian, the mask was not meant to simply look impressive. It was designed as a spiritual safeguard, a literal armor for the young pharaoh in the afterlife. The weight also reflects the importance the Egyptians placed on permanence and eternity. Gold, to them, was not just a luxury. It was considered the flesh of the gods. When Howard Carter unearthed the tomb in 1922, the mask became an immediate symbol of both opulence and mystery. But it wasn't just treasure. It was a message. The elaborate details, like the inscriptions carved on the back for protection, reveal a worldview where death was just another form of life, and kings remained kings even in eternity. The heaviness of the mask, quite literally, anchored that belief. And considering Tutankhamun's relatively short and unremarkable reign, it's even more remarkable that so much gold was used to honor him. This wasn't about personal legacy. It was about tradition, continuity, and the power of myth. That weight wasn't just physical. It carried the entire weight of an empire's beliefs about life, death, and divinity. In the Soviet Union, education was seen not just as a civic duty, but as an experiment in shaping the ideal citizen. One of the more unusual aspects of this effort was the development of experimental schools that aimed to supercharge young minds through intense intellectual training, what officials sometimes called brainstorm schools. These institutions didn't just teach math and literature. They explored ways to accelerate brain development through structured problem solving, exposure to philosophy at early ages, and even mild psychological conditioning. Inspired by Marxist ideals of building a rational, scientific society, some schools were set up to identify gifted children and nurture them into future scientists, engineers, and leaders. The focus was on high achievement, innovation, and collectivist thinking. Children participated in logic drills, chess tournaments, and group discussions designed to push critical thinking beyond traditional age limits. In some cases, education even crossed into neuroscience, using early studies in cognitive development to test whether children could be trained for genius. Not all these experiments were successful, and some critics argued they created undue pressure or fostered conformity. But the legacy of these schools is still felt today. Many prominent Soviet scientists, including contributors to space exploration and nuclear research, came from these programs. In retrospect, the brainstorm model reflects both the ambition and the intensity of the Soviet vision, that minds could be molded, knowledge could be engineered, and greatness could be planned. Whether it worked or not, the attempt itself was one of history's boldest educational experiments. The Antikythera mechanism is one of the most astonishing archaeological finds in history, a bronze device discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of Greece in 1901. At first glance, it seemed like a collection of corroded gears. But as scientists studied it over the decades, they realized they were looking at something extraordinary, a complex, gear-driven machine that functioned as an ancient analog computer. Built sometime between 150 and 100 BCE, the device could predict lunar and solar eclipses, track the movements of planets, and model the irregular orbit of the moon, all using a sophisticated series of interlocking gears. This was technology thought to be centuries ahead of its time. Nothing even close to it would be seen again until the development of intricate clockwork in medieval Europe, nearly 1,400 years later. The mechanism was likely used for both scientific and astrological purposes, and may have been created by followers of Archimedes or other Hellenistic scientists. Its existence forces historians to reconsider the technological capabilities of the ancient world. How many other marvels were lost to time? The craftsmanship suggests not just genius, but a lineage of advanced mechanical engineering, knowledge that vanished after the Roman Empire's decline. Today, parts of the Antikythera mechanism are preserved in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and researchers continue to study its hidden gears through advanced imaging. It's a reminder that ancient civilizations were not just spiritual or warlike, they were also brilliant, curious, and deeply precise. When we think of history's great composers, it's easy to imagine them bathed in applause, basking in fame, or lounging in gilded salons. But for many, the reality was far less glamorous. Mozart, Schubert, and even Beethoven struggled with poverty throughout much of their lives. Take Mozart. Despite his genius, he died with debts and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. His fame didn't translate into financial security. He worked on commission, often hustling for patrons, performing in salons, and teaching music to make ends meet. Franz Schubert composed over 600 songs and symphonies, but he never enjoyed significant wealth. His friends occasionally pooled money to help him survive. Even Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the most revered names in classical music, spent years fighting for financial independence, relying on inconsistent patronage from aristocrats. These composers lived in a time when music wasn't a mass-market product. There were no record labels, streaming royalties, or global tours. Success depended on favor from the elite or unpredictable public performances. Many had to balance creativity with the demands of survival. Their poverty often shaped their work, emotionally, stylistically, and practically. They composed feverishly, not just for expression, but to eat. Some died young, worn down by illness and stress. And yet their legacy endures, their struggles hidden beneath the perfection of their melodies. We hear only the beauty, not the hunger behind the notes. In the end, their music outlived their hardship, becoming timeless precisely because it was born in adversity. Military mascots have long been part of regimental life, but some animals went beyond the symbolic. They were enlisted. Among the most famous are goats, especially in British military history. These weren't just pets or good luck charms. They had names, ranks, and duties. One of the most legendary examples is William Windsor, a goat who served in the 1st Battalion of the Royal Welsh Regiment. He wore his own uniform, participated in ceremonial duties, and even had a service number. His role was no joke. In parades, he would march with the unit, led by a goat major, an actual soldier assigned to manage him. When William once misbehaved during a parade in Cyprus, refusing to walk and butting other soldiers, he was formally demoted for misconduct. Yes, the army held a disciplinary hearing for a goat, but he was later reinstated with full honors. This tradition dates back to the 18th century, when goats were thought to boost morale, especially during long postings in foreign lands. Some regiments believe it started during the American Revolutionary War, when a goat wandered onto the battlefield and refused to leave the troops. Since then, goats have appeared in various armies, symbolizing loyalty, strength, and endurance. Their presence creates a sense of continuity and culture, especially in regiments with long-standing traditions. While modern warfare no longer needs animals for tactical reasons, the military goat endures, a living reminder that sometimes courage comes on four legs and with horns polished for inspection. In the lavish courts of ancient China, emperors weren't just warriors, administrators, or spiritual figures. They were also gamers. One of the most popular pastimes among Chinese emperors was the game of Go, an intricate strategy board game believed to be over 2,500 years old. More than just a leisure activity, Go was considered a tool for developing intellectual discipline, strategic thinking, and even moral character. Its simple black and white pieces mask a complexity that can take a lifetime to master. Emperors like Wu of Liang and even military generals were said to spend hours studying the game's patterns, seeing it as both mental training and an art form. In fact, Go was often included in the education of noble sons, alongside calligraphy and poetry. To be good at Go meant you could think ahead, weigh risks, and understand the balance of power, all essential traits for ruling a vast empire. For emperors, it was a way to simulate conflict without the bloodshed. Some rulers even used Go metaphors in real-world governance, describing battles and alliances as moves on an invisible board. It's a reminder that intellect was as prized as swordplay in ancient courts. Go wasn't just entertainment. It was a reflection of a worldview, a way to understand human nature, chaos, and control. While emperors played under golden lanterns, with carved jade pieces, the real stakes were often psychological, learning to lead by learning how to lose. And in that sense, every game was preparation for empire. When people in ancient Rome got hungry, they didn't just stop at taverns or cook at home. Some actually ordered food that was delivered, including a precursor to what we might call pizza. Archaeologists have found evidence that Roman citizens, particularly in cities like Pompeii, relied on street vendors and Thermopylae, small shops with counters for hot food, for their daily meals. But more fascinating is that baked flatbreads topped with ingredients like olive oil, cheese, and dates were sometimes delivered directly to homes. While this wasn't pizza as we know it today, it was astonishingly close. These Roman flatbreads were cheap, filling, and versatile, popular among the working class and slaves alike. Mosaics and writings even describe or depict food runners carrying orders. Early food delivery, 2,000 years ago. In Pompeii, which was preserved under volcanic ash, researchers have found structures resembling modern takeout windows and homes with built-in ovens for reheating. The Romans were urban planners, and their bustling cities supported entire networks of food preparation and delivery. What's remarkable is how familiar it feels. The basic idea of fast, accessible, portable food is something we associate with modern life. But ancient Romans had it down. They weren't just engineers and philosophers. They were also innovators in convenience. When we order pizza today, we're part of a culinary tradition older than we think. One that started not with a phone call, but with a toga and a knock at the door. When Peter the Great sought to modernize Russia in the early 18th century, he didn't stop at military reforms or industrial changes. He even legislated culture, including how people danced. In his effort to bring Russian society in line with Western European customs, Peter made ballroom dancing a legal requirement for the nobility. It wasn't optional. If you were a courtier or noble attending social functions, you had to participate in the dance floor rituals. This decree was part of his broader campaign to westernize Russia, replacing traditional customs with European-style etiquette. Peter saw dancing not just as entertainment, but as a tool of social control, a way to refine the elite, encourage interaction between men and women, and break down old cultural barriers. He even held mandatory assemblies known as assembles, where nobles were expected to mingle, dance, and behave according to newly imported manners. Attendance was tracked, and non-participation could hurt your standing with the court. This imposition was radical at the time. Russian society had long been governed by strict customs, often segregating the sexes and limiting social engagement. By forcing nobles into waltzes and minuets, Peter was reshaping their worldview, one dance step at a time. It wasn't always welcomed. Many resented the reforms. But for Peter, progress meant discomfort. His reign wasn't just about conquering territory. It was about conquering tradition. And in his Russia, if you couldn't dance, you didn't belong. That ballroom wasn't a stage. It was a proving ground. In the pursuit of beauty, history shows us that people have taken extraordinary risks, and nowhere is that more literal than with the lead-based makeup worn by ancient Roman and Renaissance European nobles. This deadly cosmetic, often referred to as Venetian ceruse, was made by combining white lead with vinegar to create a smooth, opaque paste. Women, and sometimes men, applied it to their faces to achieve a ghostly white complexion, which was associated with wealth, purity, and nobility. Pale skin meant you didn't work outdoors like a common laborer. But this ideal came at a terrible price. Lead is a powerful neurotoxin. Prolonged use caused skin deterioration, hair loss, severe abdominal pain, and even death. Over time, users became addicted to applying more, as their skin decayed beneath the surface. Some even used lead-based powders to cover the wounds caused by earlier applications, creating a vicious cycle of self-poisoning. Despite the dangers, the fashion endured for centuries. Queen Elizabeth I was known to use it heavily, and portraits show her face increasingly mask-like with age. Medical knowledge at the time didn't fully grasp the connection, or society simply ignored the risks in favor of appearance. It's a haunting example of how beauty standards can override survival instincts. The same society that built architectural marvels and scientific tools also willingly embraced a slow, cosmetic death. In the end, elegance came with a cost, one hidden in plain sight, on the very faces of the elite. The Roman Empire is remembered for its vast reach, architectural marvels, and powerful rulers. But beneath the grandeur was a harsh truth. The average reign of a Roman emperor lasted just 5 years. That's not a sign of peaceful transition. It's a reflection of just how brutal Roman politics could be. Emperors were rarely elected or chosen in a stable manner. Many came to power through force, bribery, or inheritance, and they just as often lost power through assassination, rebellion, or political intrigue. Some emperors ruled for decades. Augustus reigned for over 40 years, but many lasted only months or even days. In the 3rd century alone, the empire went through over 20 emperors in just 50 years, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a time of civil war, economic collapse, and constant power struggles. The Praetorian Guard, originally created to protect the emperor, often became kingmakers, choosing new leaders and killing old ones when it suited them. Even in more stable times, emperors faced constant threats from rivals, generals, or senators. Being at the top was dangerous. The palace was more like a pressure cooker than a throne room. Despite their short reigns, these emperors shaped the fate of millions, waged wars, built monuments, and enforced laws. But their own survival was often the shortest part of the story. In Rome, power came. When we picture pirates, we often imagine a black flag with a white skull and crossbones, the infamous Jolly Roger. But historical pirate flags were far more varied and surprisingly strategic. Some were red, signaling no mercy. Others were white, offering quarter if the enemy surrendered. Some featured hourglasses to warn that time was running out, or swords and bleeding hearts meant to intimidate. There were even flags with no skulls at all. Some had full skeletons holding spears. Others had peaceful or abstract symbols. Pirates understood that their flags were tools of psychological warfare. A terrifying banner could scare a merchant crew into surrendering without a fight, saving lives and time. The most effective pirates were not reckless brutes, but calculated tacticians who used fear as currency. The Jolly Roger became iconic because of its simplicity and stark symbolism, but it was just one of many designs in the pirate arsenal. Not every pirate even flew a distinct flag. Some would raise a false national flag to approach ships unnoticed, only revealing their true identity at the last moment. The truth is, piracy in the so-called Golden Age, roughly the late 1600s to early 1700s, was a business, albeit a brutal one. And just like any enterprise, branding mattered. Flags weren't just cloth. They were silent messages: surrender or suffer. The legend of the skull and crossbones persists today, but the real pirate flags were a spectrum of fear, negotiation, and clever manipulation on the high seas. In medieval banquets, the food wasn't just about taste, it was also about spectacle. One of the most jaw-dropping culinary traditions of the time involved serving pies filled with live birds. Yes, literally. Live birds would be placed inside massive, hollow pastries and then released when the pie was cut open, creating a fluttering, dramatic surprise for the guests. This bizarre practice wasn't just for shock value. It was a way for nobles to show off their wealth and creativity, transforming the dinner table into theater. It inspired the old nursery rhyme, "Sing a Song of Sixpence," which mentions 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. These weren't meals, they were performances. Medieval feasts were occasions to impress political allies or outshine rivals, and food was often the centerpiece of that display. It's also important to note that the birds were usually placed in after the pie was partially baked, with a crust formed like a lid or decorative cage. Sometimes musicians, or even jesters, were hidden inside enormous dishes, all part of a tradition of illusion and extravagance. This was a world before TV or social media, where entertainment had to be tactile and immediate. Today it might sound cruel or absurd, but in medieval courts, these stunts were symbols of innovation, luxury, and social status. The meal didn't just feed the stomach, it fueled gossip, awe, and political clout. A bird-filled pie wasn't a joke, it was power on a plate. History is filled with stories of nations rising and falling, but some countries were so short-lived, they barely lasted a single day. One famous example is the Republic of Sonora in 1853, a self-declared country in the northwestern part of Mexico, led by American filibuster William Walker. He invaded with a private army, declared independence, and proclaimed himself president. Within days, the effort collapsed due to lack of support and resistance from Mexican forces. Another example is the Principality of Sealand, a micronation declared on an abandoned sea fort off the coast of England in 1967. Though it still claims sovereignty, it's not recognized by any government. Then there's the Republic of Rhode Island, a platform built off the Italian coast in 1968, which declared independence, only to be destroyed by the Italian Navy shortly after. These miniature experiments in nationhood often emerge from idealism, opportunism, or outright eccentricity. They reveal how the concept of a country isn't as fixed as we think. Borders, governments, and national identities are shaped by power, recognition, and time. And when one of those elements is missing, a country can vanish as quickly as it appeared. In some cases, like with Sonora, these brief moments still left an impact, highlighting political tensions and personal ambitions. In others, they serve more as curiosities, footnotes in the chaotic and often surreal narrative of world history. These one-day nations remind us how fragile the idea of sovereignty can be, and how quickly it can unravel. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the most legendary military leaders in history, and also one of the most misunderstood, especially when it comes to his height. Popular culture paints him as unusually short, even giving rise to the term Napoleon complex, used to describe short men with aggressive behavior. But this stereotype doesn't hold up to the facts. Napoleon was actually of average height for a Frenchman of his time, standing around 5 feet 6 inches or 5 feet 7 inches by modern measurements. The confusion partly stems from a difference in units. French inches were longer than British inches. British newspapers, who were eager to mock and demonize him, reported his height using their own system, which made him seem shorter than he was. In reality, Napoleon was often surrounded by the tall soldiers of his elite imperial guard, which might have made him appear smaller in contrast. But among ordinary people of early 19th century France, he was quite normal in stature. The myth stuck because it served political and psychological narratives. British cartoonists caricatured him as a tiny tyrant. His opponents found it easier to belittle him, literally, than to acknowledge his strategic genius. Over time, this image became cultural shorthand. But the real Napoleon was a complex and commanding figure who loomed large on the battlefield and the political stage. His impact was anything but small, even if his legacy includes one of history's most persistent physical exaggerations. When most people think of Africa, they often picture a continent rich in wildlife, deserts, or ancient civilizations. But what many don't realize is that Africa is the most politically diverse continent on Earth, home to 54 countries, more than any other continent. That means nearly a third of the world's nations are located within Africa's borders. This diversity stems from complex historical factors, including thousands of years of indigenous development followed by intense periods of colonization, artificial border drawing, and eventual independence movements. During the colonial era, European powers divided Africa based more on convenience than culture, carving up entire regions with little regard for language, ethnicity, or local governance. After the wave of decolonization in the mid-20th century, new nations emerged quickly, and boundaries were often maintained to avoid conflict, even if they didn't match traditional territories. Today, Africa's countries range widely in size, population, economy, and language. Nigeria alone has more people than Russia. Algeria spans a massive desert. Tiny island nations like Seychelles have their own unique cultures. This sheer variety makes Africa incredibly dynamic, politically, culturally, and economically. It also challenges the stereotype of Africa as a single monolithic place. Instead, it's a mosaic of peoples and systems. So the next time someone generalizes about Africa, remember, they might be referring to any one of 54 nations, each with its own story, government, and vision for the future. That makes the continent not just big, but unimaginably complex and important. In the 13th century, Paris was not just a city of poets and philosophers. It was Europe's largest urban center. With a population approaching 200,000, it outpaced London, Rome, and Constantinople at various points in the medieval era. Paris owed its explosive growth to a mix of geography, politics, and intellectual fervor. The Seine River made it a trade hub, while the rise of the Capetian dynasty made it the political and cultural heart of France. But perhaps its greatest claim to fame in the 1200s was the University of Paris, one of the most prestigious learning institutions in the world. Scholars flocked there to study theology, law, and philosophy, giving the city an aura of intellectual brilliance. At the same time, Paris was expanding physically. Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame rose above the skyline. Bustling markets filled the streets, and bridges connected the growing neighborhoods. Life was far from glamorous. Streets were dirty, disease was common, and class divisions were stark. But Paris had the energy of a metropolis on the rise. It was a melting pot of languages, professions, and ideas. This period laid the groundwork for Paris's later identity as a cultural capital. By the Renaissance, it would be famed for art and fashion. By the Enlightenment, for revolution and philosophy. But its first golden age was in the medieval twilight, when students debated in Latin, merchants haggled in alleyways, and the city of lights first began to flicker. When we think of natural geography, rivers seem like a given, carving valleys, shaping cities, and nourishing civilizations. But some countries are entirely without them. Take Saudi Arabia, for instance. Despite its vast landmass, there are no permanent rivers within its borders. Instead, the country relies on seasonal riverbeds called wadis, which occasionally fill during rare rains but remain dry most of the year. This reflects the extreme aridity of the Arabian Peninsula, where water has always been a precious resource. To survive, ancient and modern Saudis developed intricate systems of wells and oases, and today, the country relies heavily on desalination plants to turn seawater into drinkable water. Another riverless nation is Vatican City, the smallest country in the world. Nestled within Rome, it has no natural rivers simply because of its tiny size, about half a square kilometer. Its water needs are met through infrastructure provided by Italy. Other countries without rivers include Bahrain, Kuwait, and Monaco. Their lack of rivers hasn't stopped them from thriving. Instead, it's shaped how they develop. In the absence of flowing fresh water, these nations have leaned on modern technology, ancient ingenuity, and international cooperation to manage water supplies. The absence of rivers in these places reminds us that geography is only part of a nation's story. People adapt, cultures innovate, and the human relationship with water, whether through rivers, reservoirs, or rainfall, remains one of the most fundamental forces shaping civilization. Adolf Hitler is one of the most reviled figures in history, responsible for unimaginable horrors during World War II. Yet one of the strangest details about him is that he promoted ideas that seem, at face value, almost wholesome. He was a vegetarian and an anti-smoking crusader. This isn't historical revisionism, it's fact. Hitler's diet was meat-free for most of his adult life, though not necessarily out of compassion. His motivations were a blend of health concerns, personal aversions, and ideological beliefs. He associated meat eating with bodily decay and weakness. He often dined on vegetable broths, mashed potatoes, and pasta, and discouraged his inner circle from eating meat in his presence. As for smoking, Hitler saw it as a degenerate habit. He banned it in many public spaces, raised cigarette taxes, and even launched anti-smoking campaigns, decades before similar policies took hold in Western democracies. Pregnant women were discouraged from smoking, and tobacco advertising was restricted. Ironically, Nazi Germany was one of the first governments to study and publicize the health risks of smoking. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Healthy habits in the hands of an authoritarian don't equal morality. Hitler's personal choices didn't make him enlightened or ethical. They were part of a broader obsession with purity, control, and ideological conformity. His vegetarianism didn't extend to compassion for human life, and his anti-smoking zeal was less about public health than national strength. It's a disturbing paradox that someone capable of such cruelty also promoted behaviors we associate with well-being. The idea that the Great Wall of China is visible from the moon has been repeated so often that it's become folklore, even appearing in trivia books and school lessons. But it's simply not true. The myth likely began centuries ago, long before space travel was possible. as a way to emphasize the wall's massive scale. When astronauts finally made it to space in the 20th century, they quickly dispelled the rumor. From low Earth orbit, you can sometimes spot the wall under ideal lighting and weather conditions. But even then, it's incredibly difficult. It blends in with the landscape and isn't a straight line. From the moon, which is about 384,000 kilometers away, it's absolutely invisible to the naked eye. NASA confirmed this repeatedly, as did Chinese astronauts. The wall may be long, stretching over 13,000 miles when counting all its branches, but it's narrow and made of materials that match the color of the surrounding terrain. What is visible from space are larger features like cities, coastlines, and major highways, not ancient stone walls. The persistence of the Great Wall myth speaks to how we romanticize history and landmarks. We want ancient feats to remain visible, almost eternal, like scars on the planet. The wall is a staggering human achievement, a symbol of resilience and defense. But its greatness doesn't need lunar visibility to be real. It's enough that it still stands, snaking across mountains, whispering stories from dynasties long gone. In popular imagination, the Middle Ages are often depicted as a time of ignorance and superstition, where people believed the earth was flat and feared sailing off its edge. But this is a myth. In reality, educated people in medieval Europe overwhelmingly accepted that the earth was a sphere. This knowledge wasn't secret or controversial. It was widely taught in universities and based on ancient Greek and Roman texts. Thinkers like Aristotle had reasoned the earth was round centuries before, and their ideas were preserved and passed down through medieval scholars. Navigators observed ships disappearing hull first over the horizon, and astronomers tracked the curved shadow Earth cast on the moon during lunar eclipses. These weren't mysteries. They were evidence of a round world. The idea that medieval people thought the earth was flat only gained popularity in the 19th century, pushed by writers eager to portray earlier eras as dark and backward in contrast to modern science. Ironically, it was this Victorian myth-making, not the Middle Ages themselves, that gave rise to the flat earth stereotype. Medieval cosmology had its oddities, of course: geocentric models, mystical spheres, and religious interpretations of the cosmos. But flat earth theory? That simply wasn't part of the picture. The myth persists today because it's dramatic and easy to believe. But the truth is far more interesting. Even in a world lit by candlelight, medieval minds were reaching for the stars, and they knew they lived on a globe. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't the end. It was a transition to another realm. And for those who could afford it, entering the afterlife in style was part of the plan. That's why some Egyptian mummies were covered in gold paint or gilded in thin sheets of actual gold. Gold wasn't just a status symbol. It had deep spiritual significance. Egyptians believed gold was the flesh of the gods, a material that didn't tarnish and symbolized eternity. Covering a mummy in gold was a way to physically associate the deceased with the divine, ensuring a more favorable place in the afterlife. For elite individuals, pharaohs, nobles, and high priests, the mummification process included elaborate rituals, special resins, and sometimes literal gold coatings. Faces and hands were often gilded, and burial masks, like the iconic mask of Tutankhamun, were crafted from gold to preserve the individual's features in divine form. Recent scientific analysis of some mummies has even revealed gold-based paint applied after death, indicating how important appearance remained even beyond the grave. These golden mummies were not merely decorative, they were deeply symbolic. In a culture where the journey after death was long and perilous, any divine association improved one's chances of reaching paradise. The shimmer of gold wasn't just for the living. It was a passport to immortality. And today, It serves as a glittering reminder of how the ancient Egyptians fused wealth, religion, and artistry into one breathtaking ritual of remembrance. In the muddy trenches of World War I, where death was constant and hope was fleeting, French soldiers found a surprising source of comfort: song. Not solemn hymns or patriotic marches, but drinking songs. Known as chansons à boire, these tunes were often bawdy, humorous, and defiant, filled with innuendo and irreverence. In the cold and chaos of trench warfare, singing became a form of survival. Soldiers would gather in dugouts or around makeshift campfires, passing around wine or brandy when they could, and belt out familiar tunes. These songs bonded units, raised morale, and momentarily pulled men out of their grim reality. Lyrics mocked commanders, romanticized women back home, and laughed in the face of death. Some songs dated back to earlier wars. Others were invented in the trenches themselves. One of the most famous was La Madeleine, a cheerful ballad about a barmaid who refused all advances and captured the hearts of soldiers. Singing also served as a psychological weapon, boosting courage before attacks and drowning out the silence after bombardments. Officers sometimes tolerated the practice, recognizing its importance for morale, though others dismissed it as undisciplined. But to the men in the trenches, these songs weren't frivolous. They were shields made of melody, a way to stay human in inhuman conditions. In a war that introduced mechanized slaughter, the simple act of singing became a quiet rebellion, a chorus of defiance echoing across no man's land, fueled by wine, camaraderie, and the will to live another day. In the bustling Roman city of Pompeii, luxury and innovation were everywhere, including in the plumbing. Residents of this ancient metropolis had access to aqueducts, public fountains, and even indoor plumbing. But there was a catch. Many of their water pipes were made of lead, known as plumbum in Latin, which gave rise to the word plumbing. Lead was cheap, easy to shape, and durable. Roman engineers used it to channel water throughout cities, unaware of its toxic effects. In Pompeii, lead pipes snaked beneath homes, baths, and public buildings, supplying fresh water from nearby sources. While the Romans were brilliant engineers, they didn't understand that lead could slowly poison them. Modern scientists have tested ancient pipes and confirmed elevated levels of lead in the water that flowed through them. That doesn't necessarily mean all of Pompeii's citizens were suffering from lead poisoning. The flow of water may have diluted some of the risk, but it does raise questions. Chronic exposure could have led to neurological problems, infertility, and even behavioral changes. Some historians speculate that widespread lead use contributed to health issues across the Roman Empire, although that remains debated. In Pompeii, the lead pipes were just one part of an advanced infrastructure system that included heated floors, flush toilets, and organized street layouts. But even advanced societies can make fatal assumptions. For all their brilliance, the Romans unknowingly piped poison into their homes, and history would only realize it centuries later. At a glance, it's hard to imagine forks and spoons, basic utensils we use daily, as controversial. But in medieval and Renaissance Europe, these tools were seen as unnecessary at best and downright heretical at worst. The fork, especially, drew suspicion. Originating in the Middle East and adopted in Byzantine courts, it slowly made its way westward. When it arrived in Italy in the 11th century, it scandalized some clergy. Using a fork was seen as rejecting the natural tools God gave humans, their hands. More than that, it was viewed as an indulgence, a sign of vanity and effeminacy. Some even went so far as to label them devil's tools, accusing users of pride and moral corruption. Spoons faced less opposition, but still carried associations with luxury and foreign influence. For centuries, most people ate with their hands, knives, or a piece of bread. Forks were associated with decadence, foreignness, and high society, not the humble piety that was idealized by the church. Even monarchs hesitated. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly used a fork, but only rarely. It wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that forks became widely accepted across Europe, particularly in France and England. The shift reflected broader changes in dining etiquette, hygiene, and evolving class structures. What began as suspicion eventually turned into acceptance, and then habit. Today, a fork and spoon are symbols of civilization. But not long ago, they were viewed as defiance on a plate and a threat to your soul. In medieval Europe, monks weren't just scribes, brewers, or caretakers of ancient texts. Some of them were also leech farmers. It sounds grotesque today, but in a world where medicine relied heavily on balancing the body's humors, leeches were considered a vital tool for healing. Bloodletting was thought to cure everything from fever to headaches, and leeches were the preferred method, especially for delicate patients. Monasteries, with their quiet gardens and access to fresh water, became perfect places for cultivating leeches. Monks would gather them from ponds and keep them in clay jars or troughs filled with water, carefully feeding and maintaining their slimy livestock. In some abbeys, leech farming was so extensive that it formed a small economic ecosystem. Monks would sell leeches to doctors, apothecaries, and other monasteries. The practice continued for centuries, even into the 19th century, when leech therapy reached industrial levels in Europe. Entire shipments of leeches were exported to urban hospitals. Monks played a role not just in preserving religious or literary traditions, but in supplying what was then considered high-end medical equipment. Today, leech therapy has made a surprising comeback in modern medicine, especially in reconstructive surgery, because of its ability to improve blood flow. But centuries ago, it was the monks, quiet, methodical, and endlessly patient, who managed these creatures in stone-walled cloisters. It's a strange image, men of faith raising blood-sucking worms to heal the sick. Yet in the world of medieval healing, that was considered divine service. Masabumi Hosono was the only Japanese passenger aboard the Titanic, and when he returned home after surviving the disaster, he wasn't welcomed as a lucky man. He was shamed. In Western newspapers, he was described as a coward who had snuck onto a lifeboat, violating the noble code of women and children first. But in Japan, the criticism ran deeper. Newspapers and government officials condemned him not just for surviving, but for failing to die honorably. In early 20th century Japan, cultural expectations were rooted in values of self-sacrifice and group loyalty. The idea that a man would prioritize his own survival, especially at the expense of others, clashed with ideals of Bushido, the samurai code, which still shaped national identity. Hosono lost his job at the Ministry of Transport and became a national disgrace. Yet the truth of his actions was far less dramatic. He boarded a lifeboat only after it became clear there was space and no one else was boarding. He didn't push or steal a spot. He merely survived. For decades, he remained a symbol of dishonor until his story was re-examined by historians and even referenced in official Titanic exhibits. His family later found a letter he wrote describing his ordeal with humility and pain. Today, some Japanese citizens see Hosono as a victim of cultural rigidity and wartime propaganda rather than a villain. He survived a tragedy and lived with another kind of wreckage the rest of his life. Public shame for choosing to live. Iceland, an island nation nestled in the North Atlantic, holds a remarkable distinction in global geopolitics. It has no standing army, no tanks, no fighter jets, no permanent military force. For a modern nation, this seems almost unthinkable. But Iceland has managed it since gaining independence from Denmark in 1944. It does maintain a small coast guard, and it relies on defense agreements, most notably with the United States and NATO, to handle broader security. During the Cold War, the U.S. even had a military base at Keflavik Airport, strategically located between North America and Europe. But even then, Iceland itself didn't form an army. The country's geographic isolation and lack of bordering nations helped make this possible. With no direct threats and a population smaller than most cities, Iceland chose to focus on diplomacy and peacekeeping rather than force projection. It's not that Iceland is pacifist. It has contributed troops to international missions like those in Afghanistan, but it does so through volunteer deployments, not a professional army. Iceland also boasts one of the lowest crime rates in the world and ranks high in global peace indexes. For Icelanders, national security doesn't mean tanks in the streets. It means education, resilience, and strong alliances. Their unique approach challenges the assumption that every nation needs armed forces to be safe. In a world often defined by military budgets and arms races, Iceland quietly proves there is another way, one rooted not in weapons, but in wisdom. Before stepping onto the battlefield, ancient Greek soldiers often consumed something pungent, sharp, and, to us, oddly specific: garlic. But this wasn't for taste or culinary flair. To Greek warriors, garlic was a source of strength, protection, and even courage. The practice was so deeply embedded in military tradition that it earned garlic the nickname warrior's herb. Soldiers believed the strong, fiery bulb would energize them, boost endurance, and offer supernatural protection. In a culture where gods and omens were part of daily life, garlic wasn't just food, it was a spiritual weapon. Historical records mention its use before major engagements, and it wasn't limited to common foot soldiers. Even elite fighters used garlic as part of their ritual preparations. To some extent, the Greeks were onto something. Garlic contains compounds that promote blood circulation and have mild antibacterial properties. Though ancient warriors didn't understand biochemistry, they recognized the invigorating effect. Garlic's role wasn't limited to battle, either. It was used medicinally and religiously, rubbed on wounds, or left at crossroads to ward off evil spirits. This one humble bulb had a mythical status, its smell trailing behind advancing armies. So next time you smell garlic in the kitchen, remember, for ancient Greek soldiers, that scent was tied to battle cries, sword clashes, and prayers to Ares. It was as much a part of warfare as bronze armor or sharpened spears. A talisman in the form of a vegetable, worn not on a chain, but on the breath. The idea of chastity belts, those medieval-looking metal contraptions supposedly used to keep women pure while their husbands were away, is a myth more rooted in imagination than historical fact. Contrary to popular belief, there's almost no credible evidence that such devices were used in the Middle Ages. The earliest accounts of chastity belts don't appear until centuries later, during the Renaissance, and even those were likely satirical or symbolic. The myth really gained traction in the Victorian era, a time obsessed with morality, sexual repression, and bizarre inventions. It was during this period that museums began displaying chastity belts as if they were genuine medieval artifacts. But modern historians and archaeologists believe many of these devices were either outright fakes or misinterpretations of medical restraints or torture tools. The truth is, no functioning society could realistically expect a woman to survive daily life locked inside a metal device. It would have caused infections, injury, and unimaginable discomfort. But the idea was too juicy for storytellers and moralists to resist. A physical symbol of controlling women's sexuality, wrapped in the drama of knights, crusades, and noble honor. The chastity belt became a favorite of both historical fiction and museum curiosity. Today, it lingers in pop culture, treated as historical fact in movies and jokes. But it's really a mirror reflecting Victorian anxiety, not medieval reality. The myth says more about those who believed it than the time it supposedly came from. It may surprise many to learn that Joseph Stalin, the future Soviet dictator responsible for millions of deaths, began his adult life in a very different setting, a seminary. Born in Georgia in 1878, young Ioseb Jugashvili, later known as Stalin, was enrolled in the Tiflis Theological Seminary at age 15. His mother, a devout Orthodox Christian, hoped he would become a priest. For a time, it seemed he might. He studied scripture, attended religious services, and lived under strict monastic discipline. But even then, signs of rebellion flickered beneath the surface. Stalin began reading banned literature, works by Marx, Darwin, and radical thinkers. He questioned church dogma and authority, often clashing with teachers. Eventually, he was expelled in 1899, officially for missing exams, though his growing interest in revolutionary politics was likely a key factor. After leaving the seminary, Stalin plunged into Marxist activism, organizing strikes and distributing pamphlets. The church, which had once tried to shape his moral compass, had instead sharpened his defiance. His theological education, ironically, may have helped shape his future as a propagandist and ideological leader. He understood the power of belief, the mechanics of ritual, and how systems of faith could bind people together or control them. Stalin turned that understanding into a ruthless political weapon. The path from altar boy to autocrat wasn't linear, but it's a chilling reminder that even the most powerful tyrants can start in places meant for peace and prayer. Peter the Great, one of Russia's most transformative rulers, had a famously complicated relationship with tradition, especially when it came to appearances. In his quest to modernize Russia and bring it closer to Western European standards, Peter made a bold, and frankly strange, move. He banned beards. In a country where facial hair had deep cultural and religious significance, especially among Orthodox Christians, this was more than a grooming preference. It was a declaration of war on old ways. In 1698, after returning from his diplomatic Grand Embassy tour of Europe, Peter issued a decree that all men, particularly nobles and government officials, must shave their beards. Those who refused were required to pay a beard tax. To enforce it, tax collectors would give out tokens, small, coin-like badges that proved the wearer had paid for the privilege of keeping their beard. The tokens bore inscriptions like, "The beard is a superfluous burden." The idea wasn't just about hygiene or fashion. Peter viewed beards as symbolic of the backwardness he wanted to eliminate. In his mind, Russia needed to shed its medieval customs and embrace the clean-shaven face of European modernity. Unsurprisingly, the policy sparked outrage among traditionalists and clergy. For many, shaving wasn't just vanity, it was sacrilege. But Peter, known for his iron will, wasn't swayed. Through beard bans and taxes, he reshaped not just appearances, but the very identity of Russian society, one face at a time. When we look at medieval maps today, it's easy to laugh at how wildly inaccurate they appear. Continents out of proportion, sea monsters on the waves, and Jerusalem often placed at the center of the world. But these maps weren't meant to help travelers find their way. They were symbolic, not practical, theological diagrams as much as geographic representations. One of the most famous medieval map types was the TO map, which divided the known world into three parts: Asia, Europe, and Africa, separated by a T of water, the Mediterranean and Nile, and enclosed in an O, the ocean. East was often placed at the top, aligning with the Garden of Eden or the direction of the rising sun. reflecting religious importance rather than magnetic orientation. These maps were created by monks and scholars, not navigators, and were more concerned with expressing divine order than showing accurate landforms. They emphasized biblical locations, saints' journeys, and moral lessons embedded in geography. Monsters and mythical creatures were not errors, but warnings, metaphors for spiritual danger or the unknown. Cartography in this period wasn't about travel, it was about worldview. It wasn't until the Renaissance, fueled by exploration and the rediscovery of classical knowledge, that maps began to resemble modern tools. But understanding medieval maps requires stepping into the mindset of the time. The world wasn't just a physical place. It was a spiritual landscape, mapped not with science, but with scripture and imagination. The image of Nero playing the fiddle while Rome burned is one of history's most enduring and misleading myths. According to popular legend, Emperor Nero stood on a rooftop, calmly playing his violin as flames consumed his city in 64 AD. It's a damning picture, a mad, self-absorbed tyrant ignoring the suffering of his people. But there's one glaring problem. The fiddle, or violin, didn't exist in ancient Rome. It wouldn't be invented until more than 1,400 years later. So what's the truth behind the tale? First, Nero was indeed emperor during the Great Fire of Rome. And yes, much of the city was destroyed. But historical accounts from sources like Tacitus suggest Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. When he returned, he reportedly opened his private gardens to refugees and helped organize relief efforts. As for the musical detail, some versions claim Nero sang or played the lyre, an instrument that did exist at the time. Still, even that's speculative. Roman historians, especially those writing after Nero's death, had strong political motivations to discredit him. The image of a ruler idly playing music while his capital burned was too tempting a symbol of incompetence and cruelty. Over centuries, the myth evolved, and the fiddle became a modern stand-in. The result is a convenient caricature, Nero as the ultimate example of failed leadership. But history is rarely that simple. The truth lies somewhere between the propaganda and the flames. In the early days of the ancient Olympic Games, the events looked very different from what we recognize today. Among the standard contests like wrestling and running, there were also demonstrations of brute strength, and that included hurling rocks. Not finely crafted javelins or discuses, but literal heavy stones. These weren't primitive versions of modern sports, but separate challenges designed to showcase raw power. Athletes would train to lift and throw stones as a testament to their physical might. The stones varied in size, shape, and weight, sometimes reaching up to 60 or even 100 kilograms. Unlike the javelin, which relied on speed and technique, stone throwing was about endurance and explosiveness. It wasn't about finesse. It was about showing the gods and the crowd who had the power of a warrior. This tradition has echoes in other ancient cultures too, like the Scottish Highland Games, where stone putting still survives in a more ceremonial form. In the Greek context, the act had ritual significance. The Olympics weren't just sporting events. They were religious ceremonies dedicated to Zeus. Victory meant divine favor. So, when a competitor hurled a massive stone across the field, it was more than a test of strength. It was a sacred display. Over time, these rough displays were refined into the discus and shot put, but the roots were always there. Simple, primal, and elemental. Before standardized equipment and Olympic committees, athletes didn't need a perfect form, just a strong arm and the will to dominate. In 16th century England, beards weren't just facial hair, they were a financial liability. Under the rule of King Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I, the English crown implemented a peculiar form of taxation, a beard tax. The logic was as absurd as it was arbitrary. Beards were seen as a symbol of status, masculinity, and sometimes rebellion. By taxing them, the monarchy not only generated revenue, but also exercised control over personal appearance. The tax rates were reportedly based on the wearer's social status, and even the length of the beard. In Elizabeth's time, beards longer than 2 weeks' growth could incur a fee, creating an odd incentive for frequent shaving, or at least careful grooming. The exact records of how strictly this tax was enforced are scarce, and it may have been more symbolic than widely collected. Still, it reflected a broader pattern in history where appearance became entangled with authority. Monarchs used fashion and grooming laws to assert control, set class boundaries, or fill the treasury. Russia's Peter the Great later adopted a similar beard tax, even going so far as to force nobles to carry beard tokens proving they'd paid. The English beard tax stands as a strange reminder that even something as natural and personal as facial hair wasn't free from the reach of the state. In a world where taxation can affect everything from tea to tattoos, the idea of paying for your whiskers doesn't seem quite so distant, just more ironic. In the 1800s, science was rapidly evolving, but not everyone was welcome to participate, especially women. Despite growing literacy and interest in scientific education, women were systematically excluded from universities, laboratories, and professional societies. One of the strangest and most condescending justifications for this exclusion was the theory of brain overload. Prominent male physicians and educators argued that women's brains were inherently smaller and more delicate, and that exposing them to rigorous intellectual work could damage their health, particularly their reproductive organs. Some believed that too much studying would divert energy away from the womb, rendering women infertile or emotionally unstable. Others warned that women who pursued science risked becoming manly or unsexed. These pseudoscientific claims weren't fringe beliefs. They were widely taught in medical schools and cited in government policy. As a result, many talented women were pushed to the margins of science or forced to work in secret, often publishing under male pseudonyms or contributing without credit. Despite this, women like Mary Anning, Ada Lovelace, and Marie Curie made profound contributions. Over time, advocacy, social reform, and undeniable brilliance began to break down barriers. But the legacy of brain overload is a cautionary tale of how culture and bias can weaponize science to maintain inequality. It wasn't biology that held women back. It was a fear of what might happen if they were allowed to compete on equal footing. A fear cloaked in science, but rooted in control. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is often remembered as a tale of English chivalry and knightly valor, but the truth is far more grounded in mud and muscle, and a surprising hero, the English longbowmen. Outnumbered and exhausted, the English army led by King Henry V faced a much larger French force on a narrow, muddy field. Traditional narratives might expect a clash of mounted knights in shining armor, but it was the thousands of English archers, many of them commoners, who turned the tide. Armed with longbows, a weapon that could fire arrows over 200 yards with enough force to pierce armor, these archers unleashed a devastating hail of fire. The battlefield's muddy terrain, worsened by rain, worked against the heavily armored French knights. As they charged, they became bogged down, their armor sinking in the muck. The longbowmen, positioned on the flanks and protected by wooden stakes, kept firing with deadly precision. French casualties were massive. Estimates suggest that over 6,000 French soldiers were killed compared to only a few hundred English. It wasn't brute force or gallantry that won the day. It was tactical positioning, terrain advantage, and the relentless volleys of well-trained archers. Agincourt shattered the romantic image of medieval warfare as noble and knightly. It showed that the battlefield was evolving, where humble foot soldiers and strategic planning could triumph over aristocratic might. The myth of knightly supremacy died in the mud of Agincourt, buried under a rain of arrows. When we think of maps today, we instinctively understand that north is at the top. It's so ingrained that any map drawn differently feels wrong. But historically, maps weren't always this way. In fact, for centuries, many maps were drawn with east at the top, not north. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding of geography. It was a reflection of religious and cultural priorities. In medieval Europe, east held deep symbolic meaning. It was the direction of the rising sun, a representation of rebirth and divine light. Most importantly, it was associated with the location of the Garden of Eden and the city of Jerusalem. That's why many medieval maps, especially Mappamundi, which were designed more to explain the world than to navigate it, placed east at the top. In Arabic and Islamic mapmaking, south was often placed at the top because that's how maps were oriented when facing Mecca. The shift to north-oriented maps began gradually with the rise of modern navigation and the magnetic compass, which always pointed north. As seafaring became more scientific in the age of exploration, consistency and function started to override symbolism. Eventually, north became the global standard, but only because it best served the navigators of the time. The idea that north is up is a convention, not a natural truth. In a way, every map is a kind of cultural storytelling, and turning the world on its head, literally, shows just how much perspective shapes reality. When most people hear the word crusades, they immediately picture knights in shining armor battling in the deserts of the Holy Land. But what's less commonly known is that the Crusades also reached the cold forests and pagan tribes of northeastern Europe, particularly Lithuania. In fact, one of the last regions in Europe to convert to Christianity, Lithuania became the target of what historians call the Northern Crusades. These campaigns were sanctioned by the Pope and carried out by the Teutonic Knights, a militarized religious order, during the 13th and 14th centuries. Unlike the Middle Eastern Crusades, these weren't about reclaiming sacred Christian lands from Muslims. Instead, they were aimed at forcibly converting the Baltic pagan peoples. Lithuania resisted Christianization longer than any other European state. Its warriors were fierce, its culture deeply rooted in pre-Christian beliefs, and its geography difficult to conquer. The conflict lasted for decades, marked by brutal battles, scorched villages, and shifting alliances. Eventually, Lithuania embraced Christianity, but on its own terms. In 1386, Grand Duke Jogaila converted to Catholicism and married a Polish queen, beginning the Polish-Lithuanian Union. This diplomatic move effectively ended the Crusades in the region. But the idea that crusading was strictly a Middle Eastern affair is a myth. The wars of faith extended far beyond Jerusalem, reaching deep into the frozen lands of Europe, where the clash between sword and soul played out just as violently. Lithuania's crusade wasn't an echo of the Holy Land. It was a front line in its own right. Music is often thought of as ephemeral, something fleeting and emotional, but archaeology tells a different story, one of ancient melodies etched into history itself. The world's oldest known written melody dates back over 3,400 years and comes from the ancient city of Ugarit, located in present-day Syria. This musical piece, known as the Hurrian Hymn No. 6, was discovered on a clay tablet inscribed in cuneiform, using the Hurrian language. The tablet includes not just lyrics, but actual musical notation, marking a rare convergence of early written language and structured sound. Scholars believe the hymn was dedicated to the goddess Nickel, and likely played on a type of lyre or harp. Translating the melody was a complex task, requiring expertise in ancient languages, comparative musicology, and a bit of interpretive guesswork. Though we can't be certain exactly how it sounded, reconstructions based on the notation offer haunting, beautiful glimpses into humanity's earliest attempts to preserve music. This ancient hymn predates Greek musical theory and even the Psalms of the Bible. It reminds us that music isn't just a cultural byproduct, it's fundamental to who we are. The fact that someone, thousands of years ago, not only created a song but developed a way to pass it down speaks to a universal human need to connect, to express, and to remember. In those ancient notes, scratched into clay, we hear not just melody, but memory, the oldest song still singing across time. Long before modern bureaucracies or standardized testing, ancient China pioneered one of the earliest and most sophisticated merit-based civil service systems in human history. Beginning formally in 605 AD during the Sui dynasty, the imperial examination system was designed to select government officials based on knowledge, not lineage. The exams tested candidates on their mastery of Confucian texts, classical Chinese literature, philosophy, and even poetry composition. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of birthright, intellect and education would determine a man's rise through the ranks. Passing the exam, especially at the highest level, guaranteed not only a prestigious government post, but also immense social mobility. Poor families would invest heavily in their sons' education in hopes of lifting the entire household status. The process was grueling. Exams lasted several days, were taken in tiny cubicles, and required near-total memorization of complex texts. Despite its flaws, such as regional bias and limited access for women or the poor, the system inspired similar bureaucratic models across East Asia and even in parts of Europe centuries later. For over 1,000 years, this examination system remained the backbone of Chinese governance, producing generations of scholar officials who helped shape the empire's laws and culture. Its influence continues to echo in modern education systems that emphasize testing and meritocracy. It was one of the earliest examples of a state recognizing and institutionalizing the value of knowledge and scholarship, an ancient model of government built on brains, not blood. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it buried the Roman city of Pompeii in ash and pumice, freezing a moment of ancient life in eerie, volcanic stillness. While the preserved buildings, frescoes, and bodies are world famous, it's the graffiti scrawled across the city's walls that offers an even more intimate window into the everyday lives of its people. These messages, etched by citizens, visitors, and perhaps even drunk passers-by, range from declarations of love and insults to simple observations like, "I ate here." This casual note is one of dozens found on the walls of taverns, homes, and public baths, proving that the urge to leave a mark, even a trivial one, is timeless. Other graffiti included jokes, political endorsements, and messages as raunchy or absurd as anything found on modern bathroom stalls. One reads, "Successus was here." Another boasts about sexual conquests, and others grumble about bad wine or poor service. The graffiti is often shockingly modern in tone, reminding us that ancient Romans were not that different from us. They gossiped, bragged, flirted, and complained, and they did it publicly with whatever writing tool they had. For archaeologists, this unfiltered commentary offers an invaluable look at Roman culture from the ground up. It's not history carved in marble. It's scratched into plaster, full of slang and personality. In many ways, Pompeii's graffiti is the ancient world's version of social media, spontaneous, personal, and deeply human. After the devastation of World War II, nations across Europe were rebuilding, grieving, and trying to find ways to express gratitude toward their allies. In this spirit, one small French village made an extraordinary gesture. In 1949, the village of Gradet in Normandy gifted an entire hamlet, including buildings and land, to the United States as a heartfelt thank you for its liberation. The gift was specifically made to honor the memory of American soldiers who had died in the effort to free France from Nazi occupation. The village had seen firsthand the horrors of occupation and the sacrifices made by Allied troops during the Normandy invasion. By donating this land, they hoped to offer a permanent symbol of appreciation, a piece of France forever tied to American bravery. The hamlet was transferred to a U.S. veterans organization, and while it wasn't developed into a functioning American town, it remained under U.S. stewardship as a symbolic piece of transatlantic friendship. This unique act of gratitude didn't receive widespread media attention at the time, but in the years since, it has been rediscovered as a powerful story of international solidarity. In a war often remembered for its brutality and loss, this small French village offered something remarkable, not just thanks, but real land, rooted in history and emotion. It stands as a quiet but profound reminder of the bonds forged in war and the enduring human instinct to give something back when words aren't enough. In one of the most bizarre and lesser-known chapters of Nazi experimentation, the German regime during World War II reportedly tried to train dogs to talk. The initiative, part of a broader effort known as Tiersprechschule or Animal Speech School, stemmed from Adolf Hitler's fascination with animals and his belief in their untapped intelligence. The program was based in the town of Luttenberg, where a group of dogs were trained to communicate using barks, growls, and even physical signs resembling speech. Some claims suggest that a few dogs learned to say simple words like Mein Führer by mimicking the sounds through trained barking patterns. One dog, named Rolf, allegedly used his paw to tap out letters and hold rudimentary conversations. Though it may sound like a cartoonish oddity, Nazi officials took the research seriously. The idea was to use these animals as sentries, messengers, or even to replace humans in certain tasks. But despite years of effort, the dogs never truly learned to talk. The project was eventually abandoned, likely due to both its impracticality and the turning tide of the war. The records that survived were sparse and largely dismissed as pseudoscience. Still, the fact that an authoritarian regime poured resources into teaching dogs to speak illustrates the strange blend of ambition, desperation, and superstition that colored parts of Nazi ideology. It's a surreal reminder that even amidst the horrors of war, bizarre ideas flourished, and not all of them involved weapons or strategy. In one of the most desperate and ethically disturbing chapters of World War II, the Soviet Union trained dogs to act as living anti-tank weapons. Known as dog mines, these animals were fitted with explosives and trained to run under enemy tanks, detonating upon contact. The idea was born from necessity. Facing a technologically superior German force, the Soviets looked for any advantage, and dogs, with their speed, loyalty, and trainability, seemed like an unconventional solution. Trainers would teach the dogs to associate food with crawling under stationary tanks. Then, they were fitted with a special harness carrying a bomb and a trigger mechanism that would explode upon impact with a vehicle's underside. In theory, it was a grimly clever tactic, but in practice, the results were tragic and chaotic. Many dogs became confused in the chaos of the battlefield, returning to their own lines, sometimes detonating among Soviet troops. Others ran toward familiar Soviet diesel tanks rather than the unfamiliar-smelling German gasoline engines. Reports from the front lines described both the occasional success and the heartbreaking failure of these missions. Thousands of dogs were trained, and while they did manage to destroy some enemy vehicles, the method was widely seen as cruel and unreliable. Eventually, the Soviet military phased out the program, though it left a haunting legacy. These dogs weren't willing soldiers, they were victims of war. It's a stark example of the extremes nations will go to in warfare, blurring the line between innovation and horror. During World War II, the United States waged a battle not only with bombs and bullets, but with paper. Millions of propaganda leaflets were dropped from the sky over Japanese cities, carefully crafted to sway civilian opinion, lower morale, and encourage surrender. These weren't crude messages. They were written in fluent Japanese and varied from psychological warnings to direct instructions. Some warned civilians to evacuate specific areas that were about to be bombed, lending an eerie credibility to the leaflets when those threats were followed by destruction. Others depicted the futility of resisting Allied forces, detailed Japanese military losses, or even contained photographs of prisoners of war being treated well to counter fears of brutal captivity. The psychological campaign, known as Operation Starvation among other code names, had a clear goal: break the will to fight from within. One famous leaflet listed the names of 12 cities scheduled for bombing. Then, days later, those exact cities were hit. For some civilians, this surreal accuracy planted seeds of doubt in Japan's ability to win the war. While the effectiveness of these leaflets is still debated by historians, they were part of a larger effort to weaken enemy resolve without direct confrontation. The U.S. dropped over 60 million leaflets by war's end. For those on the ground, it must have been a strange and unnerving experience to look up not just at planes and smoke, but at fluttering pieces of paper, silent messengers of a distant, deadly warning. To the Aztecs, cacao wasn't just a delicious beverage, it was currency. The beans used to make chocolate were so highly valued that they became an essential part of the Aztec economy. Cacao beans were traded in markets alongside textiles, tools, and food, and they held such importance that their value was strictly regulated. A rabbit might cost 10 beans, a prostitute 8 to 10 beans, a slave several hundred. Counterfeiting cacao became a crime. People sometimes tried to hollow out beans and fill them with dirt to mimic the real thing. The beans' value came from both their rarity and their cultural significance. Cacao was believed to be a gift from the gods, particularly the deity Quetzalcoatl. Drinking it was a ritual act reserved for warriors, nobility, and priests. The frothy chocolate beverage, often mixed with chili and spices, was a symbol of power and status, not a sweet treat, but a bitter, sacred elixir. When the Spanish arrived and observed this unique economy, they were fascinated by the use of edible money and quickly adopted cacao into European culture, though they altered the flavor, adding sugar and milk. Over time, cacao would lose its role as currency but gain a new identity as a global delicacy. Still, the idea that ancient Mesoamericans once paid rent, taxes, or wages with chocolate beans is both strange and deeply human. A reminder of how something now seen as indulgence was once a cornerstone of civilization. Johann Sebastian Bach, one of the greatest composers in Western history, once landed in jail, not for scandal, crime, or politics, but for simply trying to quit his job. In 1717, Bach was employed as court organist and concertmaster for the Duke of Weimar. Though it was a prestigious position, Bach was frustrated by the lack of advancement and limited creative freedom. When a more appealing offer came from Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen, Bach accepted it. But in an era where musicians were treated more like servants than artists, simply resigning wasn't an option. When Bach formally requested release from his duties, the Duke of Weimar refused, and when Bach persisted, the Duke responded by throwing him in jail for too stubbornly insisting on his resignation. Bach was imprisoned for nearly a month before being unceremoniously released and allowed to leave. It was a humiliating experience for a man of his talents, but also a telling reflection of the times. Musicians weren't yet the revered cultural icons we know today. They were often at the mercy of aristocratic whims, their lives dictated by patronage and politics. Bach's imprisonment didn't halt his creative output. If anything, his move to Cothen allowed him to flourish, composing some of his most beloved instrumental works there. Still, the image of this musical genius pacing in a jail cell, punished for wanting artistic freedom, is a striking reminder of how even brilliance can be shackled by social norms and power structures. Christopher Columbus, the man credited with discovering the Americas, died in 1506, still firmly convinced that he had reached the outskirts of Asia. Despite 4 separate voyages across the Atlantic and overwhelming evidence of a new, previously unknown landmass, Columbus held on to the belief that he had reached the East Indies, the rich lands of China, Japan, and India described by Marco Polo. His entire mission had been based on finding a westward sea route to Asia, and acknowledging that he had found something entirely different would have undermined the very foundation of his voyages. Even as other explorers like Amerigo Vespucci began describing the New World as a separate continent, Columbus refused to change his story. He identified Caribbean islands as parts of Asia and named them accordingly, claiming he had found the outer edges of the Asian continent. This error wasn't just personal pride. It had political and financial implications. Columbus had negotiated titles and rewards from the Spanish crown based on reaching Asia. Admitting failure could cost him everything. Ironically, the lands he encountered would eventually be named after someone else entirely, Amerigo Vespucci, whose letters and maps helped cement the idea of a new continent. Columbus's insistence on a false belief, even in the face of mounting contradiction, is a fascinating window into how discovery and denial can coexist. The explorer who changed the world died never realizing the true magnitude of what he had done. Winston Churchill is best known as Britain's defiant wartime leader, the man who rallied the nation during its darkest hour with rousing speeches and bulldog determination. But in 1953, Churchill received one of the world's highest honors not for military leadership or diplomacy, but for literature. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his mastery of historical and biographical description, as well as for brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values. It might surprise people that a man remembered for battle cries and cigar smoke was also an accomplished author. Churchill wrote millions of words over his lifetime: histories, biographies, essays, and speeches. His 6-volume work, The Second World War, and A History of the English-Speaking Peoples, showcased not just detailed historical analysis, but his vivid narrative style. Churchill's literary output wasn't a side hobby. It was essential to his livelihood. Unlike many politicians, he didn't just dictate ideas to ghostwriters. He spent hours writing, revising, and polishing his prose, often staying up late into the night to meet deadlines. His writing paid his bills, shaped public memory, and preserved his version of history. The Nobel Committee recognized that his storytelling shaped more than just British morale. It influenced how the 20th century would be remembered. His literary skill made complex events accessible, gave politics emotional weight, and ensured his voice echoed long after the speeches ended. Churchill didn't just lead through war. He led through words, and history, quite literally, rewarded his pen. The image of a Viking warrior wearing a horned helmet has become one of the most enduring and recognizable icons in popular culture. It appears in movies, cartoons, Halloween costumes, and even sports mascots. But here's the catch: it's entirely a modern invention. Actual Viking helmets were practical, made for protection, and never included horns. In battle, horns would have been a dangerous liability, easily grabbed or snagged, making the wearer vulnerable. Archaeological evidence confirms this. All the authentic Viking helmets discovered are hornless, often simple iron constructions with nose guards. The horn myth can be traced back to the 19th century, particularly in the world of opera and romanticized European nationalism. When composer Richard Wagner staged his epic operas about Norse mythology, costume designers added horned helmets to give characters a more dramatic, savage look. Artists of the time embraced this visual exaggeration, and soon, the image stuck. It aligned with Victorian-era ideas about barbaric Northern Europeans and their ancient warrior spirit. From there, it was picked up by illustrators, filmmakers, and eventually modern media. What started as theatrical flair became accepted historical fact in the public imagination. But the real Vikings were seafarers, traders, and farmers, far more practical and less costume-friendly than the myths suggest. The horned helmet is a great example of how compelling visuals can overwrite truth. It's not just incorrect, it's never even been plausible. Yet it continues to march through pop culture like a warrior of fiction, horns and all. In medieval Europe, the understanding of human anatomy was deeply flawed, limited by religious taboos, lack of dissection, and heavy reliance on ancient texts. Among the many misconceptions that prevailed, one of the strangest was the belief that the brain served no real purpose. Some scholars considered it little more than a cooling system for the blood, a kind of radiator to prevent the heart from overheating. This idea, rooted in ancient Greek thought, particularly Aristotle's teachings, persisted for centuries. The heart, they believed, was the true seat of emotion, intelligence, and the soul. The brain was seen as passive, a biological afterthought. Medical training in the Middle Ages often meant studying Galen and other classical authors whose writings were revered as unchallengeable truths. Since dissection of human bodies was rare or outright banned in many places due to religious restrictions, there were few chances to correct these errors through first-hand observation. Instead, theories were passed down unchanged, no matter how bizarre. It wasn't until the Renaissance and the work of thinkers like Andreas Vesalius that these assumptions were overturned through direct anatomical study. He proved, through painstaking dissection and detailed illustrations, that the brain was more than just cranial filler. But for hundreds of years, the organ we now associate with thought, memory, and identity was dismissed as largely irrelevant. It's a testament to how long incorrect ideas can persist when tradition and authority go unchallenged, and how fragile scientific progress can be when it's chained to dogma. In ancient China, during the reign of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the brutal authoritarianism of the regime manifested in chilling ways. One of the most infamous being the execution of 460 Confucian scholars. The reason? Officially, they were accused of spreading subversive ideas and undermining imperial authority. But some accounts suggest the emperor's fury was triggered, in part, by the failure of court magicians and scholars to predict or prevent a string of natural disasters, including severe weather. Qin Shi Huang, obsessed with immortality and divine favor, took these weather anomalies as signs of disloyalty or incompetence. When floods and storms disrupted the empire, someone had to take the blame. In the emperor's eyes, that someone was the intellectual class. The scholars, many of whom adhered to Confucian principles of governance, were already at odds with Qin's legalist regime, which prioritized strict laws and centralized control. Their public criticism, coupled with their inability to appease the heavens, sealed their fate. They were buried alive or executed en masse in what became known as one of the most notorious purges of knowledge in Chinese history. It wasn't just a violent reaction to dissent, it was a calculated effort to consolidate power by silencing opposition. This act also coincided with the infamous burning of books that didn't align with the emperor's ideology. Together, these actions cast a long shadow over intellectual freedom in ancient China and serve as a grim reminder of how absolute power reacts to both criticism and climate, with blood. During the Vietnam War, the United States explored countless unconventional tactics to gain an edge in a complex, unfamiliar battlefield. One of the most curious methods involved using pigeons equipped with tiny cameras. These were no ordinary birds. They were highly trained messengers turned airborne spies. The idea was simple but ingenious. Attach lightweight, automated cameras to homing pigeons and release them over enemy territory. As the pigeons flew home, the camera would snap photos at timed intervals, capturing images of terrain, troop movements, and supply routes from the sky. The U.S. military, recognizing the pigeons' remarkable ability to navigate and return to specific locations over long distances, saw them as a low-tech yet effective solution for reconnaissance in areas where planes couldn't fly undetected. The pigeons were hard to spot and nearly impossible to shoot down. And unlike drones, they made no sound. The photographic quality, though limited by the technology of the time, was often surprisingly clear. While this operation never became widespread or publicly documented in full detail, declassified materials and military insiders have since confirmed that such missions were indeed tested and occasionally deployed. It's a bizarre footnote in military history. Birds turned into Cold War-era surveillance tools, while satellites and spy planes ultimately took over the role of aerial reconnaissance. These winged scouts represent a time when creativity and necessity drove the military to try just about anything. In a war defined by unconventional warfare, even pigeons became part of the arsenal. In one of the most bizarre moments in church history, there was a serious attempt to make a baby pope. The strange event took place in the 10th century, during a period of intense corruption and political manipulation within the papacy, often referred to as the Saeculum Obscurum or the Dark Century. During this era, powerful Roman noble families treated the papacy like a throne to be inherited, using bribery, force, and even murder to place their relatives, sometimes completely unqualified, into the highest religious office. One of these families allegedly tried to elevate an infant to the papal seat to maintain their control. While records are murky and often secondhand, chroniclers from the time suggest that a child not yet able to walk or speak was briefly put forward as pope. The move was clearly symbolic. The baby wouldn't lead, but would serve as a puppet while power remained firmly in the hands of the child's family. The church, even in its most chaotic phases, ultimately rejected the absurdity. But the attempt reveals just how unstable and politically charged the Vatican had become. It wasn't faith that ruled in these moments, but dynastic ambition. That a pope could be proposed who couldn't recite a single prayer is a surreal testament to how far from spiritual leadership the institution had drifted. Though quickly dismissed, the story endures as a chilling and strangely comical example of how religion, power, and desperation can collide in the most unlikely ways. In the Soviet Union during the 20th century, the state wasn't just focused on building a powerful army or expanding industry. They also dreamed of engineering the perfect mind in a bold and unsettling experiment. The USSR created specialized schools intended to raise genius children. These weren't typical classrooms. Students were selected from a young age for their intelligence, and some were even the offspring of hand-picked intellectual parents, matched in a kind of human breeding logic. The goal was to accelerate cognitive development through intensive education, strict discipline, and ideological conditioning. One of the most famous examples is the physico-mathematical school network, where math and science were pushed to extremes, and success was measured by academic output and conformity to Soviet ideals. Children were expected to become the next generation of physicists, engineers, or ideological leaders. Some did thrive. These schools produced world-class scientists and chess grandmasters, but others struggled under immense pressure. The emotional toll of this kind of upbringing was often ignored. Creativity was stifled if it didn't align with state goals, and individuality was seen as a distraction from collective excellence. The experiment reflected a broader Soviet belief that human potential could be engineered like machines or buildings. That genius wasn't born, but built through state control. Today, we look back at these schools with a mix of admiration and unease. They produced brilliance, yes, but at what cost? It's a haunting legacy of how even intelligence can become a political project. Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius and emperor who reshaped Europe, was famously fearless on the battlefield, but oddly, he had a peculiar fear in private life. He reportedly suffered from a phobia of open doors. This strange aversion, called agoraphobia in some cases, or fear of open spaces, seemed to manifest for Napoleon as a need for total control over his environment. He demanded that doors in his presence be either fully closed or fully open, never left ajar. Servants and aides were trained to comply with this preference, ensuring doors were handled precisely to avoid making him uncomfortable. Though it may sound like an eccentric quirk, it reveals something deeper about Napoleon's psyche. He was obsessed with order, discipline, and authority, not just in military strategy, but in the smallest details of his surroundings. In a world where power often meant vulnerability, controlling space may have been a way to control anxiety. Some accounts suggest that his fears stemmed from childhood trauma or paranoia later in life, particularly as conspiracies and assassination threats mounted. Whether it was a full-blown phobia or just a deep discomfort, the emperor who seemed larger than life was still human, subject to irrational fears like anyone else. It's a reminder that even the most commanding historical figures had private vulnerabilities. Behind the grand portraits and thunderous speeches was a man who, at least in one peculiar way, was unnerved by something as simple as a slightly cracked door. Centuries before the official discovery of Antarctica in 1820, maps from earlier periods appear to depict a mysterious southern continent. One of the most famous is the Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral. It shows the coastlines of Africa, South America, and intriguingly, what some believe to be an ice-free Antarctic continent. This has puzzled researchers for decades. How could a 16th century mapmaker include details of a continent covered by miles of ice, and supposedly unknown to the world? Some theories suggest ancient civilizations had explored Antarctica long ago, and that this knowledge was passed down through lost or obscure sources. Others argue that early explorers may have encountered the continent's ice shelves and misinterpreted them as a southern landmass. Skeptics point out that the resemblance could be coincidence, or the result of cartographers guessing about what lay beyond the known world. During the Renaissance, mapmakers often filled in blanks with imaginative geography or speculative data. Still, the uncanny outlines on these old maps fuel debates about just how much ancient and medieval people really knew. Did they possess fragmented remnants of a forgotten maritime history? Or are we simply reading too much into imperfect records? The idea that Antarctica was known, or even glimpsed, before the age of modern exploration adds a layer of mystery to human history. Whether it's evidence of ancient knowledge or a cartographic fluke, those early maps continue to provoke wonder about the limits of our understanding. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire for the seemingly absurd price of just $7.2 million, which breaks down to about 2 cents per acre. At the time, many Americans thought it was a colossal waste of money. Newspapers mocked the deal as Seward's Folly, named after Secretary of State William H. Seward, who had negotiated the purchase. The public couldn't understand why the U.S. would pay millions for what they assumed was an empty, frozen wasteland. Russia, on the other hand, was eager to sell. The territory was difficult to defend, expensive to maintain, and geographically isolated. They also feared losing it to the British without compensation in some future conflict. For the U.S., Alaska's value wasn't immediately obvious, but Seward had a long-term vision. Decades later, the decision would seem prophetic. Alaska turned out to be rich in natural resources: gold, oil, timber, and fish. The Klondike Gold Rush in the 1890s brought a wave of fortune seekers. Oil fields discovered in the 20th century turned it into a critical energy asset, and its strategic position between Russia and the continental U.S. made it a key military outpost during the Cold War. What was once ridiculed became one of the greatest land deals in history. That 2-cent per acre investment has paid dividends many times over. Today, Alaska stands not just as a state of breathtaking beauty and vast wilderness, but also as a reminder that what looks foolish in the moment may be visionary in hindsight. The term Dark Ages conjures images of ignorance, superstition, and cultural decline, a time when science vanished, art froze, and progress came to a halt after the fall of Rome. But that narrative is outdated and misleading. In fact, many historians today reject the term entirely, calling it a myth that oversimplifies a rich and complex era. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, it didn't plunge Europe into total darkness. Learning continued in monasteries, where monks preserved ancient texts and copied manuscripts. The Byzantine Empire thrived, maintaining Roman law, literature, and engineering. In the Islamic world, scholars were advancing mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, often building on the very Greek texts Europe thought it had lost. In parts of Europe, major innovations took place. Agricultural tools improved, universities were founded, and Gothic cathedrals rose skyward. The idea of a dark age came later, popularized during the Renaissance, when scholars looked back and exaggerated their own brilliance by belittling what came before. Enlightenment thinkers continued the myth, framing the Middle Ages as backward to contrast with their own age of reason. But when you look closer, the medieval period wasn't dark, it was transforming. It laid the groundwork for much of what came after, from scientific methods to modern states. The term Dark Ages reveals more about the arrogance of later centuries than the reality of the time itself. It's not history. It's a label, and like most labels, it hides more than it reveals. Let them eat cake. The phrase has echoed through centuries as the ultimate symbol of royal indifference. It's been pinned on Marie Antoinette as a sign of her ignorance and cruelty during the French Revolution. A queen so out of touch with her starving subjects that she thought dessert was a suitable substitute for bread. But here's the truth. There's no evidence she ever said it. The quote actually predates her by decades. It appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie Antoinette was just a child, and he attributes it to a great princess, not naming her directly. Historians believe Rousseau either invented the story or was referencing someone entirely different. The phrase, "let them eat cake," or more accurately, "tu les mangent de la brioche," was probably a literary device used to criticize the nobility as a whole, not any one person. But during the Revolution, when public anger needed a symbol, Marie Antoinette became the perfect target. Foreign, glamorous, and extravagantly dressed, she was cast as the villainess in France's national drama. The quote stuck, and history ran with it. In reality, Marie Antoinette did express concern about poverty and sometimes engaged in charitable acts. But nuance doesn't make for a good slogan. So the myth lived on, fueling revolutionary rage and pop culture for centuries. Today, we remember her as the queen who offered cake instead of bread. But the truth is, she never served that line. History did it for her. In the 18th century, pale skin wasn't just a beauty standard, it was a symbol of class. To appear fair and ghostly was to show that you didn't work outdoors, that you were wealthy enough to stay indoors and untouched by the sun. But for many women, simply staying out of the sun wasn't enough. Some turned to more extreme methods, like drinking vinegar, to artificially lighten their skin. This wasn't about taste or health. It was about looking delicate, even sickly. Vinegar was believed to constrict the blood vessels and reduce redness in the face, giving the skin a more pallid, aristocratic look. In some cases, women even soaked bread in vinegar and ate it as a kind of appetite suppressant, linking pale beauty with thinness. The consumptive appearance, looking like you were wasting away from tuberculosis, was weirdly romanticized. Pale, thin, and fragile was the fashionable ideal. Of course, drinking vinegar had consequences. It could damage the teeth, upset digestion, and lead to chronic health problems. But the pursuit of beauty often outweighed the risks. Women in powdered wigs and corsets were willing to suffer discomfort, even harm, to appear refined. It was the Instagram filter of its day, only internalized literally. The vinegar drinking trend faded with time, replaced by other strange beauty rituals, but it's a stark reminder. The idea that fashion demands sacrifice isn't new. Sometimes it asked for your health, all in the name of looking noble, elegant, and terminally pale. Christopher Columbus is often remembered as the man who proved the earth was round, bravely sailing west into the unknown. But this popular story oversimplifies and distorts the truth. By the time Columbus set sail in 1492, educated Europeans already knew the earth was a sphere. This wasn't some daring revelation. Ancient Greek thinkers like Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle had all proposed a round earth centuries earlier, and Eratosthenes even calculated its circumference with surprising accuracy in the 3rd century BCE. Medieval scholars continued this understanding. The myth that everyone thought the world was flat until Columbus came along is a product of 19th century writers who wanted to frame his voyage as more revolutionary than it was. The real debate Columbus faced wasn't about the shape of the earth, it was about the size. Columbus drastically underestimated the distance between Europe and Asia by sailing west. He believed the world was much smaller than it actually is, and had it not been for the accidental presence of the Americas, his fleet would likely have run out of supplies long before reaching Asia. So in a twist of fate, Columbus's voyage succeeded not because of accurate science, but in spite of his miscalculations. The enduring myth of Columbus versus the flat earthers paints a misleading picture of both him and the intellectual climate of his time. In reality, the Earth's shape was known. What remained unknown was what lay in between, and whether there was anything, or anyone, waiting there. The modern marathon is 26.2 miles, a distance known to runners worldwide. But what's surprising is that this exact distance has no real connection to the legendary run of Phidippides, the ancient Greek soldier credited with inspiring the race. According to popular legend, Phidippides ran from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens in 490 BCE to announce a Greek victory over the Persians, after which he collapsed and died. But historical accounts vary. Herodotus, our main source, never actually mentions this dramatic sprint. Instead, he describes Phidippides running from Athens to Sparta, a much longer distance, to seek military help. The romanticized story of a fatal dash from Marathon to Athens came later, and it wasn't until the late 19th century that it became widely accepted. Even then, the first modern Olympic marathons were not standardized. The 1908 London Olympics set the distance at 26.2 miles, so the race could start at Windsor Castle and finish in front of the Royal Box. That arbitrary layout became tradition. It wasn't until 1921 that the 26.2-mile distance was officially adopted. So while the marathon evokes images of ancient heroism and endurance, its current format is more the product of British pageantry than Greek history. The story of Phidippides was reimagined, dramatized, and tailored to fit a new narrative. Today's marathon is less a faithful reenactment of history and more a tribute to a myth, one that evolved through time, politics, and a royal preference for a good view at the finish line. Discovered in 1901 in a shipwreck off the coast of the Greek island Antikythera, a corroded, gear-filled lump sat forgotten for decades. But when scientists finally studied it closely, they realized they had found something extraordinary, a device made over 2,000 years ago that functioned like an ancient computer. Now known as the Antikythera mechanism, it stunned the world. It used a complex system of bronze gears to predict astronomical positions, lunar phases, eclipses, and even dates of ancient Olympic Games. Nothing else like it was known from the ancient world, and nothing similar would appear again for over 1,000 years. Its precision was astonishing. By turning a crank, users could simulate the movement of the sun, moon, and planets. It even accounted for the moon's irregular orbit using an advanced understanding of epicyclic motion. For a long time, historians thought such mechanical sophistication didn't exist until the Renaissance. But the Antikythera mechanism changed everything. It proved that the ancient Greeks, particularly followers of Archimedes and Hipparchus, possessed not just abstract knowledge, but engineering prowess. It rewrote the history of technology. The device's origin is still debated. Was it used in a temple, by a philosopher, or a wealthy patron? We may never know. But what's clear is this. The Greeks built a machine so advanced that it seemed impossible. It challenges assumptions about what ancient people could do. The Antikythera mechanism isn't just a relic. It's a message from the past, saying, "We were smarter than you think." In medieval Europe, universities were centers of learning and, surprisingly, centers of chaos. Students at places like Oxford, Paris, and Bologna weren't the quiet scholars we imagine today. They were often rowdy, armed, and fiercely independent. And sometimes they rioted, not over politics or philosophy, but over food. One of the most infamous cases occurred in Oxford in 1355. It started in a tavern, where two students complained about the quality of wine they were served. The argument escalated. Insults turned into punches, and soon weapons were drawn. The townspeople sided with the innkeeper, and within hours, a full-scale riot broke out between students and townsfolk. It lasted days. Over 60 people were killed. The conflict wasn't just about wine. It reflected deeper tensions. Students were often outsiders, exempt from local laws, and resented by townspeople for their arrogance and legal privileges. At the same time, they felt mistreated and overcharged by local businesses. Universities were powerful, but so were town guilds. The result? A volatile mix that could erupt at the smallest provocation, like a bad meal. These town and gown riots were common throughout the Middle Ages. Universities eventually created their own courts and policing systems to keep order. But for a while, being a student meant living in a powder keg. You could be studying Aristotle one day and swinging a sword the next, all because your stew was too salty. In medieval times, education wasn't just about knowledge. Sometimes it was about survival. When the Titanic hit the iceberg on that cold April night in 1912, chaos and fear swept across the decks. But not everyone scrambled for the lifeboats. Incredibly, some of the ship's wealthiest passengers chose to stay behind, refusing to board the lifeboats even when there was space. Their reasons varied. Some believed the ship couldn't possibly sink, others didn't want to leave their valuables or loved ones, and some simply didn't want to sit in a cramped, cold wooden boat. After all, this was the Titanic, the most luxurious ship ever built. To step into a lifeboat felt like admitting failure, or worse, giving up comfort and control. One famous case was Benjamin Guggenheim, a millionaire industrialist. He and his valet dressed in formal evening wear and reportedly said, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Another was Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, who refused to leave his wife. When she insisted on staying with him, they sat side by side on deck chairs and met their fate together. These decisions weren't heroic in the traditional sense. They were deeply personal, shaped by love, pride, and disbelief. But they added to the haunting legacy of the Titanic. While others fought for space in the lifeboats, a handful of the richest, most powerful people on board quietly accepted their end, not because they had to, but because something inside them said they should. In a way, it was a final, tragic statement of dignity or denial. Peter the Great of Russia is often celebrated as the Tsar who dragged Russia into modernity. He reformed the military, founded St. Petersburg, and demanded that nobles shave their beards. But among his many radical efforts to westernize his country, there's one detail that often goes overlooked. He exhumed corpses for scientific study. In a time when such acts were seen as sacrilegious and horrifying, Peter personally supervised autopsies. He believed that understanding the human body was key to advancing medicine and education in Russia. To him, the rotting dead were not sacred relics, but opportunities to learn. He founded Russia's first anatomical theater, where dissections were performed in front of students and doctors. He even issued a decree allowing physicians to use corpses for research. But it wasn't just policy. Peter himself attended dissections, often standing alongside the surgeons. Some reports even claim he touched the cadavers himself. This obsession wasn't mere curiosity. It was driven by a belief that knowledge had to be built, no matter how unsettling the process. In the Orthodox Christian world of 18th century Russia, where bodies were supposed to rest untouched in the grave, this was deeply controversial. But Peter didn't flinch from controversy. He believed Russia could only catch up with the West by breaking taboos, even digging up the dead. His scientific efforts didn't just change Russia's institutions. They challenged the cultural line between the sacred and the secular, showing that for Peter, progress was worth any price, even disturbing the peace of the grave. Pythagoras is best known today for his famous theorem about right triangles, but in ancient times, he was more than a mathematician. He was a philosopher, mystic, and the leader of a strange and secretive cult. Among his many unusual beliefs, one of the most bizarre was his refusal to eat or even touch beans. Not because of allergies or diet, but because he believed beans contained the souls of the dead. To Pythagoras, beans weren't just food. They were portals, spiritually connected to reincarnation and the afterlife. His followers were taught that to consume a being was to risk cannibalism, unknowingly ingesting a reincarnated soul. This belief was so strong that, according to legend, Pythagoras himself died because of it. When fleeing attackers, he reportedly came upon a field of beans and refused to cross it, choosing death over spiritual compromise. The bean taboo wasn't just superstition, it was tied to his broader philosophy. Pythagoras and his followers believed in metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. They practiced strict vegetarianism, lived communally, and followed strange numerical rituals, believing that numbers governed the universe. Beings, somehow, violated their spiritual harmony. Modern scholars have speculated about medical reasons, maybe favism, a genetic disorder causing severe reactions to fava beans. But for Pythagoras, it was metaphysical. His rejection of beans might seem absurd now, but it reflects how intertwined his worldview was, where food, soul, and the cosmos were all part of one mysterious equation. For him, avoiding beans wasn't nonsense, it was sacred math. Galileo Galilei is often remembered as the scientist who clashed with the Catholic Church, a martyr for science who paid the ultimate price. But contrary to popular belief, Galileo was not burned at the stake. He died peacefully, under house arrest. His conflict with the church was real and serious, but it didn't end in flames. Galileo supported heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun, a theory that contradicted church doctrine at the time. In 1633, after publishing his findings, he was summoned to Rome by the Inquisition. Under pressure, he recanted his views, famously muttering, "And yet it moves," according to legend. The church found him guilty of heresy, but instead of execution, he was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. He spent his final years in his villa near Florence, continuing to write and conduct experiments. Though his movement was restricted, his mind remained active. He went blind near the end, but not silent. His works circulated across Europe, laying the foundation for modern physics and astronomy. The myth of Galileo's fiery death endures because it dramatizes the tension between science and religion. But the real story is more nuanced, and in some ways, more powerful. It wasn't death that silenced Galileo. It was confinement. And yet, even under watch, even forced to deny what he knew to be true, he kept working. His legacy survived, not because he died for his beliefs, but because he lived long enough to write them down. For centuries, the story of King Tutankhamun was one of grandeur, golden tombs, and mystery. But in the 21st century, science added a darker chapter to his legacy. DNA testing on the mummies of Tutankhamun and his relatives revealed a shocking fact. He was the product of incest. His father, the pharaoh Akhenaten, had children with his own sister. This revelation, made through genetic analysis of ancient remains, helped explain many of the physical deformities Tutankhamun suffered. He had a clubbed foot, a cleft palate, and signs of bone disease. These were not random afflictions. They were the result of generations of inbreeding. In ancient Egypt, royal incest wasn't scandalous. It was tradition. Pharaohs were considered divine, and marrying within the family was seen as a way to preserve the purity of the bloodline. But this practice came at a biological cost. Over time, genetic defects accumulated, and Tutankhamun paid the price. Despite his fame today, he was a frail, sickly teenager when he died, likely from complications due to illness and injury. The opulence of his tomb hides a tragic reality. The young king lived a difficult, possibly painful life, shaped by political power and family choices. Modern science stripped away the myth and revealed the man, a child of incest, shaped by dynasty, adored in death, but perhaps overlooked in life. It's a story where ancient customs and modern technology intersect, revealing that even kings, even gods on earth, were not immune to human consequences. When people think of Mozart, they imagine powdered wigs, grand symphonies, and high society elegance. But beneath the genius was a man with a wicked sense of humor, and it showed up in his music. Among his lesser-known compositions is a song titled Leck Michigan im Arsch, which translates, bluntly, to lick my arse. Yes, Mozart actually wrote this. In fact, he composed several canons and short vocal pieces filled with crude, scatological humor. It wasn't a secret joke, either. These were written for his friends and family, performed in private gatherings, and often sung with theatrical flair. At the time, such humor wasn't as taboo as it might seem today. The 18th century had its share of bawdy jokes, and Mozart was very much a product of his environment. He was close with his sister and friends, and many of these compositions were meant to entertain and shock them. The lyrics are ridiculous, often repeating phrases like "lick it well" in elaborate harmonies. But musically, they're complex, cleverly structured, and unmistakably Mozart. It's a reminder that the great composers weren't all stiff formality. They laughed, joked, and didn't take themselves too seriously. These pieces show a different side of Mozart, not the child prodigy or the tortured genius, but the prankster, the friend, the man. His legacy isn't diminished by these songs. If anything, they humanize him. Behind the grand concertos was someone who, like the rest of us, sometimes just wanted to make his friends laugh. Most people know Isaac Newton as the brilliant mind who defined gravity and revolutionized physics with his laws of motion. But few realize that the same man also spent decades immersed in alchemy, the mystical forerunner to modern chemistry. Newton wasn't just dabbling. He wrote more on alchemy than he did on physics or optics. He meticulously studied ancient texts, experimented with chemical transformations, and believed deeply in the pursuit of the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance said to turn base metals into gold and grant immortality. In Newton's time, alchemy was still a serious intellectual pursuit, blending elements of science, theology, and mysticism. For Newton, it wasn't just about wealth or eternal life. It was about unlocking the secrets of nature and God. He believed that understanding matter at its most fundamental level could reveal divine truths. Much of his alchemical work was shrouded in secrecy. He used codes and obscure symbolism, fearing not only ridicule but also persecution. It wasn't until the 20th century that his vast alchemical writings were fully studied and published. They reveal a side of Newton that's almost magical, a man who believed that the universe was filled with hidden messages and that through deep study, one could decode the divine architecture of reality. Today, we separate science from mysticism, but in Newton's world, they were intertwined. His genius wasn't confined to equations and experiments. It also lived in the margins of myth, alchemy, and the eternal quest for transformation. In an unexpected fusion of science and faith, the Vatican has officially recognized astronomical telescopes, including those used by NASA, as tools of God. This acknowledgement isn't just symbolic. The Vatican has a long-standing history with astronomy, dating back centuries. In fact, it operates its own observatory, one of the oldest in the world, located at Castel Gandolfo. More recently, it has expanded operations to a facility in Arizona, where Vatican astronomers work alongside international scientists using powerful telescopes to study the cosmos. The Catholic Church, often perceived as being at odds with science, especially after the trial of Galileo, has since evolved its stance. By calling telescopes tools of God, the Vatican suggests that exploring the universe isn't a challenge to faith, it's an extension of it. These instruments, capable of peering into the furthest reaches of space and time, are seen as a way to better understand creation. High-ranking Vatican officials, including several popes, have emphasized that science and religion are not in opposition, but are complementary paths to truth. The Vatican's astronomers study dark matter, star formation, and the potential for life beyond Earth, all within a theological framework that views scientific discovery as a means to appreciate the vastness and complexity of God's universe. It's a far cry from the days of burning books or silencing scientists. Now, the Church looks through the same lenses as NASA, not to question the heavens, but to gaze at them in wonder and perhaps reverence. In the rigid choreography of Soviet diplomacy, one custom stood out to Western observers as deeply strange. Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the USSR, would greet male foreign leaders with a full kiss on the lips. It was known as the Socialist Fraternal Kiss, a gesture meant to symbolize political closeness, trust, and ideological unity. While cheek kissing among European men wasn't unusual, the lip kiss was a distinctly Soviet twist, intimate, awkward, and heavily symbolic. Brezhnev was particularly enthusiastic about the practice. He kissed East German leader Erich Honecker so passionately once that the moment became iconic, later immortalized in graffiti on the Berlin Wall. To the Soviets, the kiss was more than etiquette. It was a political message. The more intense the kiss, the stronger the alliance. When a leader received only a handshake or a cheek kiss, it signaled cooling relations. Western leaders, of course, were bewildered. Some tried to dodge the kiss entirely. Others endured it, unsure of how to respond. President Jimmy Carter reportedly practiced different greeting scenarios with aides to avoid an uncomfortable embrace. The Brezhnev kiss wasn't just a quirk. It was soft power, Soviet style. It blended emotion, performance, and politics into a single, unforgettable gesture. And while it might seem humorous now, it reflected the seriousness with which the USSR viewed unity among socialist nations. Even diplomacy, in Brezhnev's world, came with a kiss, sometimes awkward, sometimes sincere, always calculated. In the British military, there's a long-standing tradition that blends ceremony with a touch of absurdity, and perhaps the most surprising example is the awarding of an actual military medal to a goat. The goat's name was William Windsor, often referred to as Billy, and he wasn't just a mascot. He held rank in the Royal Welsh Regiment, complete with a service number and uniform. In 2006, after years of ceremonial duty, he was awarded a medal for outstanding behavior during a parade, specifically for not stepping out of line. It wasn't just a joke. The British Army takes its regimental traditions seriously, and the goat's role dates back over 200 years. Goats have accompanied Welsh soldiers since the 18th century, initially inspired by a goat that reportedly wandered onto the battlefield after the American Revolutionary War. Since then, royal goats have been treated as full members of the unit. They march in parades, attend formal dinners, and even get promotions. When Billy misbehaved during a parade in Cyprus, refusing to keep formation, he was briefly demoted. Later, after redeeming himself, he was restored to rank. These traditions may seem silly, but they serve a purpose. In a world of rigid structure and high stress, military mascots bring levity, pride, and a sense of continuity. The goat's medal isn't about the animal, it's about identity. It honors the quirks that make a regiment unique, where even a four-legged soldier can earn a place in history. For decades, the story has circulated that during World War II, Polish cavalry bravely, but foolishly, charged Nazi tanks on horseback with sabers. It's often repeated as a tragic example of courage against impossible odds, or worse, as a mockery of Polish military strategy. But the truth is, it never happened. The myth was Nazi propaganda, designed to make the Polish army look primitive and irrational. The real event that inspired the story was the Battle of Krojanty in 1939. Polish cavalry did launch a surprise attack, not on tanks, but on German infantry. It was successful at first, routing the enemy and gaining ground. But later, German armored vehicles arrived, forcing a Polish retreat. German and Italian journalists were brought to the battlefield afterward, where they saw dead horses and soldiers, along with nearby tanks. The narrative was shaped deliberately. Poland was portrayed as backward, relying on medieval tactics against modern warfare. This false story spread quickly and stuck, especially in German and Soviet versions of history. In truth, Polish cavalry were not charging tanks. They were well-trained units using horses for mobility, dismounting to fight like infantry when necessary. They were equipped with rifles, machine guns, and even anti-tank weapons. The myth persists because it fits a dramatic, tragic narrative, noble but doomed. But real history is more nuanced. The Polish army fought valiantly, using every tool at its disposal. The cavalry story, though fake, continues to obscure the reality of their resistance and strategy. Roman women were known for their beauty rituals, and many of them followed detailed cosmetic routines to enhance their appearance. But beneath the surface of those elegant white faces was a deadly secret: lead. To achieve the ideal of pale, flawless skin, Roman women often used a foundation made of white lead mixed with vinegar or animal fat. It gave them a ghostly complexion that signified wealth and status. Only the rich could afford to stay indoors and avoid tanning under the sun. But lead, though it delivered that fashionable look, is toxic. Over time, repeated use caused chronic poisoning. Symptoms included hair loss, skin deterioration, neurological damage, and even death. Yet the trend persisted for centuries. It wasn't just the face paint. Lead was also found in lip color, eyeshadow, and rouge. Some upper-class women applied it daily, unknowingly sealing their fate with each layer. This wasn't unique to Rome, either. Centuries later, Elizabethan England revived similar trends. But in ancient Rome, where medicine was advanced in some ways yet blind to chemical hazards, the danger went unchecked. Physicians recorded symptoms, but rarely linked them to cosmetics. And because the effects were gradual, the connection to lead often went unnoticed. The tragedy is that these women, rich, educated, and powerful, were poisoned by the very products that were meant to make them beautiful. Their elegance had a hidden cost. It's a reminder that sometimes the price of beauty isn't just vanity, it's life itself. Among the many bizarre stories from ancient Rome, one stands out for its absurdity and symbolic power. Emperor Caligula supposedly made his horse a senator. The horse's name was Incitatus, and he was no ordinary animal. Caligula gave him a marble stall, an ivory manger, purple blankets, and even a palace with servants. While some historians argue the tale was exaggerated by enemies of Caligula, the symbolism remains potent. Whether literal or not, it reveals much about the emperor's reign. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 CE, a short period marked by cruelty, excess, and erratic behavior. Appointing a horse to high office, or even pretending to, mocked the Roman Senate, suggesting they were so ineffective that even a horse could do their job. It wasn't about elevating the horse, but about humiliating the humans. Caligula reveled in absolute power, and this act served as a twisted flex. Some scholars believe he never made the horse a senator, but did threaten to, which may be even more insulting. It was political theater designed to shock, intimidate, and ridicule. If his goal was to undermine confidence in the Senate, he succeeded. The story endured for centuries, becoming a symbol of despotism and absurdity in leadership. Whether myth or fact, the tale of Incitatus remains a reminder of how power, when unchecked, can descend into spectacle, turning the nobility of governance into farce and leaving behind legends that still provoke disbelief 2,000 years later. On the morning of August 27, 1896, the sun rose over the island of Zanzibar to the sound of cannon fire. Within 38 minutes, it was all over. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, often cited as the shortest war in history, was a conflict sparked by succession, colonial power, and a clash of wills. The British Empire had influence over Zanzibar, a small but strategic territory off the coast of East Africa. When the pro-British Sultan died, a relative named Khalid bin Barghash seized power without British approval. The British authorities demanded he step down. He refused. By 9 a.m., British ships in the harbor began bombarding the palace. The Sultan's defenses included a small group of palace guards and an outdated artillery battery, no match for British warships. Within minutes, most of the Sultan's artillery was destroyed. His palace caught fire, and his men either surrendered or fled. By 9:38 a.m., the white flag was raised, just 38 minutes from start to finish. Around 500 Zanzibaris were killed or wounded, while the British suffered one minor injury. Sultan Khalid fled to the German consulate, and a new pro-British sultan was installed. The brevity of the war doesn't make it less significant. It symbolized the overwhelming power disparity between imperial nations and smaller states. It was also a reminder of how quickly force could reshape leadership. A change of rulers decided in less time than a lunch break. In the long timeline of human conflict, the Anglo-Zanzibar War stands as the most fleeting and perhaps the most lopsided. The ancient Egyptians are famous for pyramids, mummies, and grand temples, but they were also surprisingly advanced when it came to medicine and personal care. Long before modern dentistry or prosthetics, they were developing tools and treatments that seem astonishing even today. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that Egyptians used toothpaste as early as 5000 BCE. Their version wasn't minty fresh. It was a gritty mix of crushed rock salt, pepper, and dried flowers, designed to clean the teeth and freshen the breath. It likely caused gum bleeding, but it worked. Toothpicks and even rudimentary toothbrushes made of frayed twigs were also common. But perhaps even more impressive are the prosthetics. In a 3,000-year-old tomb, researchers found a wooden toe attached to the foot of a mummified woman. It was crafted with remarkable precision, not just for appearance, but for function, where patterns suggest she walked with it, indicating comfort and utility. The device even had a hinge for mobility. For a civilization thousands of years old, this level of medical ingenuity is staggering. Egyptian doctors also set broken bones, stitched wounds, and performed basic surgeries. Their knowledge was recorded in detailed medical papyri, including treatments for everything from headaches to cataracts. Many of their remedies combined science with spirituality, invoking gods while applying honey or moldy bread to wounds, unknowingly harnessing antibacterial properties. The image of ancient Egypt is often one of mysticism and magic. But underneath the gold and myth, there was science, thoughtful, inventive, and far ahead of its time. During World War II, the United States military explored some truly bizarre ideas in the race to outsmart the Axis powers. One of the strangest? Bat bombs. The plan was exactly what it sounds like. Strap tiny incendiary bombs to live bats and release them over Japanese cities. The idea came from a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle Adams, who had visited the Carlsbad Caverns and marveled at the sheer number of bats. He pitched the concept to the government, arguing that bats could silently glide into buildings nest in rooftops and eaves, and, with a timed detonation, set cities ablaze from within. Surprisingly, the U.S. military took it seriously. The project was greenlit and assigned to the Army Air Forces, with full support from President Roosevelt. Thousands of bats were captured and fitted with miniature napalm devices. The testing, however, was chaotic. In one accident, armed bats escaped during a trial and burned down a military hangar. Still, researchers were impressed. The bats proved capable of carrying the payloads and roosting effectively. By some estimates, bat bombs might have caused more damage than early atomic strikes, with far less collateral. But before it could be fully developed, the project was shelved in favor of the Manhattan Project. Nuclear weapons were faster, more powerful, and less unpredictable than flying incendiary mammals. Still, the bat bomb remains one of the strangest weapons ever devised, proof that, in times of desperation, even the most unlikely ideas can take flight. In 2015, researchers examining Viking burial garments made a surprising discovery. Woven into the intricate silk patterns were Arabic inscriptions. Specifically, the words Allah and Ali were found embroidered in Kufic script, an early form of Arabic writing. The find shocked many, challenging long-held assumptions about Viking culture. These Norse seafarers, often portrayed as insular pagans, were clearly in contact with the Islamic world. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Vikings had traveled far beyond Scandinavia, trading as far east as modern-day Russia and into the Islamic Caliphate. But finding religious Islamic phrases in Viking graves added a new layer. These weren't just items obtained through trade. They were stitched into burial clothing, suggesting a deeper cultural exchange or reverence. Some theories suggest the garments belonged to women buried in elite graves, possibly symbolizing power, status, or even spiritual belief. Others argue the Vikings may not have understood the text, but appreciated the aesthetic value. Still, the fact remains, Islam left a mark on Viking society. This blurs the clean lines we often draw between cultures. The Viking world wasn't a frozen, isolated place of horned helmets and longships. It was interconnected, dynamic, and surprisingly global. The burial silks came from Central Asia, the silver coins from Baghdad, and now the inscriptions confirmed a spiritual link, however faint, to Islam. It's a reminder that even the most feared raiders of the North were part of a wider, more complex human story, one of trade, belief, and unexpected connection. In the 1920s, deep in the scientific circles of the Soviet Union, an idea emerged that sounds more like science fiction than reality: to create a human-ape hybrid. The man behind the project was Ilya Ivanov, a biologist known for his pioneering work in artificial insemination. He had already made headlines for crossbreeding animals like zebras and donkeys. But his next ambition was far more controversial. He wanted to inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm. Backed by the Soviet government, Ivanov traveled to West Africa to carry out the experiments. The goal? It wasn't just curiosity. Some Soviet officials believed creating a hybrid super soldier, part human, part ape, could lead to beings with brute strength and obedience, a possible asset for labor or war. Ivanov attempted the procedures, but none were successful. He later proposed the reverse, using ape sperm to inseminate human women, but was shut down amid growing political pressure. The project was quietly buried. Ivanov eventually fell out of favor during Stalin's purges and was exiled. While the hybrid was never created, the fact that it was ever seriously attempted reveals the era's dangerous obsession with science without ethical limits. The Soviets weren't alone in conducting dark experiments during that time, but this one stands out for its surreal ambition. Today, The idea is condemned as both unethical and biologically implausible. But in the Soviet Union's race for scientific dominance, even the boundary between man and beast was up for negotiation. Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader of Cuba, became one of the world's most controversial and enduring figures of the 20th century, and he did it while dodging over 600 assassination attempts. That number sounds exaggerated, like spy thriller fiction, but it's rooted in fact. The U.S. government, particularly through the CIA, tried everything to eliminate him. And not just bullets or bombs. The plots read like something from a James Bond parody. Exploding cigars, poison diving suits, toxic pens, pills hidden in milkshakes. At one point, they even considered dusting his clothes with a chemical to make his beard fall out, hoping it would undermine his authority. But through all of it, Castro survived. Part of it was luck. Part of it was paranoia. He constantly changed his schedule, used decoys, and surrounded himself with loyal security. He famously said that if avoiding assassination attempts was an Olympic event, he'd win gold. But there was something else. Castro understood symbolism. Every failed attempt made him stronger. He turned the narrative into proof that imperialist powers couldn't kill the revolution. In Cuban propaganda, the constant attempts only reinforced his image as invincible. Whether you admired or despised him, Castro's survival became part of his legend. His enemies called it frustrating. His supporters called it fate. But either way, he endured, outlasting U.S. presidents, economic embargoes, and decades of global pressure. In the end, Fidel Castro didn't die by gunfire or poison. He died of old age, in his bed, a rare ending for a revolutionary. Europe's map looks stable today. Countries like France, Germany, and Italy seem fixed in place. But look back just a few centuries, and the picture was completely different. European borders have been in near constant flux throughout history. Kingdoms rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed, and treaties redrew the lines again and again. In the Middle Ages, what we now call Germany was a patchwork of hundreds of tiny duchies, bishoprics, and city-states within the Holy Roman Empire. Italy wasn't unified until the 19th century, and before that it was a mosaic of rival city-states like Venice, Florence, and Naples. Poland literally disappeared from the map for over a century, partitioned by its neighbors in the late 1700s. Even France, long considered a stable power, had wildly shifting borders depending on royal marriages, wars, and colonial ambitions. The 20th century alone saw the creation and dissolution of Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, East and West Germany, and the Soviet Union. Entire countries emerged seemingly overnight. Borders weren't just changed by treaties. They were shaped by revolutions, invasions, and referendums. For people living through those shifts, identity could be confusing. One generation might be born in Austria-Hungary, the next in Czechoslovakia, and the third in Slovakia, all without leaving their hometown. This fluid history is why so many European conflicts revolved around territory and sovereignty. And even today, border disputes and nationalist movements echo that long legacy. Europe's map might look neat now, but its lines are the result of centuries of chaos. When we think of Vikings, images of fur-lined warriors and rough woolen garments usually come to mind, not luxury fabrics like silk. But historical discoveries have shattered that stereotype. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking burial clothes that include fragments of silk, some of which even contain Islamic motifs and Kufic script, the early form of Arabic writing. How did Scandinavian warriors come to wear fabrics from the Islamic world? Trade. The Viking world was far more connected than we often imagine. Through expansive trade routes stretching from Scandinavia to the Middle East via rivers like the Volga and Dnieper, the Vikings exchanged furs, amber, and slaves for silver, spices, and textiles. Centers like Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, were buzzing with high-end goods that eventually made their way north. Vikings weren't just raiders. They were skilled merchants and navigators. Silk was a status symbol, used in burial clothing or ceremonial wear to signify wealth, reach, and sophistication. Some of the silk pieces found in Sweden and Norway bear evidence of being cut and reused, scraps treasured for their rarity. The presence of Arabic script on Viking garments doesn't mean religious conversion, but it does highlight the breadth of cultural intersections at the time. These aren't just curious finds, they rewrite our understanding of who the Vikings were. Behind the helmets and axes were people connected to a vast web of civilizations, and they wore it on their sleeves. Literally,